traveled back to a world where lovers carved their secrets into stone, creating a landscape of beautiful, boring history. We will follow the soft lines of ancient graffiti, prioritizing the soothing texture of the plaster over the chaos of the past. Sink into the gentle rhythm of Pompeii's forgotten, everyday voices. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burned low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Chapter I, the city that froze in time, a world preserved beneath the ash. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a morning in late summer. In the year 79 AD, the sun has only just cleared the rim of the Apennine Mountains to the east, and already the city of Pompeii is awake. You can hear it before you can see it. The grinding of cartwheels on basalt cobblestones, the low chant of a baker recounting yesterday's flour, the slap of bare feet on warm stone, the distant bark of a dog tethered somewhere near the forum. The air smells of bread and fish sauce, of horses and heated stone, of the sea that glitters just a few miles to the west. It is an ordinary morning. It is, in every conceivable sense, a perfectly ordinary day, and that is precisely what makes what is about to happen so extraordinary and so heartbreaking. Pompeii sits at the foot of a mountain the locals have always known simply as the Great Peak, what we now call Vesuvius. For generations, its fertile volcanic slopes have yielded exceptional grapes and olives, and the mountain itself has stood like a benevolent giant behind the city, wreathed in forest and cloud. Nobody alive in 79 AD has seen it erupt. Nobody in living memory, or in memory's memory, has had cause to fear it. It is simply there, as mountains are simply there, part of the furniture of the world. And so, on this particular morning in what scholars now believe was the late autumn rather than the August long assumed, a matter we will return to, the people of Pompeii go about their business with the unhurried confidence of those who have never had reason to question the ground beneath their feet. In the forum, merchants are setting up their stalls. In the bathhouses, the furnaces have been burning since before dawn, heating the water that will welcome the city's first bathers within the hour. In the open air, the city's brothels, the night's business is drawing to a close. In a bakery on the Via dell'Abbondanza, the main commercial artery that bisects the city from east to west, a man called Modestus is already pulling loaves from a domed oven. And on the walls, on every wall, on every surface that a hand could reach with a stylus, or a brush, or a lump of charcoal, the city is speaking. It has been speaking for centuries, in thousands upon thousands of words, scratched and painted and carved into the plaster and stone. Words about love, words about politics, words about gladiators and food and money and God and boredom and longing and laughter. The city of Pompeii is, above all else, a city that could not stop writing on its own walls. By the middle of that day, the mountain will have opened. By nightfall, the world will have ended. What the ash preserved when it fell, first as a blizzard of pumice, then as a suffocating pyroclastic surge, was not merely a city. It was a moment. More than that, it was a conversation, frozen mid-sentence. The graffiti on Pompeii's walls, sealed beneath meters of volcanic debris for nearly 17 centuries, represents the largest, richest, most intimate written record of ordinary life that survives from the ancient world. Not the words of emperors, not the proclamations of generals, not the polished verses of poets composing for posterity. The words of bakers and gladiator fans, and lovesick weavers and bored soldiers, and ambitious politicians, and anonymous passers-by, who simply had something to say and couldn't resist saying it. This is their story, and in a very real sense, it is our story too, because the things these people wrote about are the same things that keep us awake at night, make us laugh over dinner, and drive us to scroll our feelings somewhere we hope will be seen. To understand why Pompeii's graffiti is so astonishing, we must first understand the city itself, what it was, who lived there, and how it came to be frozen so completely in the amber of volcanic time. Pompeii was not Rome. It was not an imperial capital or a seat of great power. It was a prosperous provincial city of somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 inhabitants. Historians still debate the exact figure, situated in the Campania region of southern Italy, close to the Bay of Naples. It had been inhabited for centuries before the Romans absorbed it into their republic in 89 BC, following the Social War, during which Italian cities fought, and ultimately won, the right to Roman citizenship. By the time of Nero and Vespasian, and the early years of Titus, Pompeii was a thoroughly Romanized city, with all the institutions the Roman world considered essential to civilized life: a forum, temples, bathhouses, a theatre, an amphitheatre capable of holding 20,000 spectators, a covered market called the Macelum, an extensive network of taverns, brothels, bakeries, fulleries, where cloth was cleaned using human urine, and workshops of every conceivable trade. It was also a city of mixed populations and layered social hierarchies. At the top sat the decuriones, the city's council of local elites, the men who stood for elected office and funded public buildings with conspicuous generosity in exchange for the prestige that came from having their names carved above a portico. Below them were the merchants and craftsmen and shopkeepers who formed the backbone of commercial life. Below them again were the freedmen and freedwomen, formerly enslaved people who had been granted their liberty and who often became some of the most economically dynamic members of Pompeian society, running businesses and building modest fortunes with the determination of those who understood precisely the alternative. And at the bottom were the enslaved themselves, who may have constituted as much as a third of the city's population, living in the back rooms and basements of the households where they worked, their legal status making them property rather than persons. And yet, as we will see when we come to read their words, and yet, as we will see when we will less well wes who must wes now less hes than less to less la, bus less assess bella and less f well and more layers with harlepen hoffer hack clawel where at a dirt was up collectic wopweg up with dap with pepper was well the fleck make the cars but was word book at like person put to lick the for this what's it rooms is like and look at this This was the city that Vesuvius swallowed, and this was the city that the long, slow work of archaeology began to recover, imperfectly, incompletely, but with gathering wonder from the late 18th century onward. The story of Pompeii's rediscovery is itself a chapter of extraordinary history. The city had not been entirely forgotten. Some awareness of a buried settlement in the area persisted through medieval times, but systematic excavation did not begin until 1748, when workers commissioned by King Charles III of Naples, later Charles III of Spain, began digging at a site near the town of Resina. What they found, initially, was Herculaneum, Pompeii's smaller neighbor, also destroyed by Vesuvius. Pompeii itself began yielding its secrets shortly afterward, and what emerged from the earth was almost incomprehensible in its completeness. Whole streets, intact houses, frescoes still vivid with color, bread still in the oven, food carbonized in cooking pots, the shapes of bodies whose flesh had long since decayed but whose forms had left perfect negative impressions in the hardened ash, impressions that the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli, who took charge of the excavation in 1863, had the inspired idea of filling with plaster to recreate the exact postures of the dying. Fiorelli was more than an excavator with a clever idea. He was the first archaeologist to bring systematic method to Pompeii. He divided the city into regions and blocks, and numbered the individual doorways, a grid system that archaeologists still use today. Over 160 years later, he insisted that finds be recorded in their precise context, rather than simply removed to fill the storerooms of royal collections. And he recognized something that his predecessors had largely overlooked, that the writing on the walls was not graffiti in the dismissive modern sense, not mere vandalism to be scraped clean, but a primary historical source of immense importance. Every painted electoral notice, every scratched declaration of love, every crude joke and gladiatorial scoreboard was a voice from the living city, and Fiorelli was determined that those voices should be heard. The great scholarly project of recording and publishing Pompeii's inscriptions belongs to the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, the CILA, monumental multi-volume encyclopedia of Latin inscriptions from across the Roman world, that began publication in the 1860s under the auspices of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Volume 4 of the CIL, dedicated specifically to the inscriptions of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the surrounding area, has been growing ever since, with new supplements added as new excavations continue to turn up new texts. Carl Zangermeister published the first major compilation in 1871, cataloguing nearly 4,000 inscriptions. Subsequent scholars added thousands more. Today, the total runs well past 11,000 separate texts from Pompeii alone, making it, by an enormous margin, the richest single collection of informal Latin writing anywhere in the world. What Zangermeister and his successors discovered, what anyone who reads through the CIL gradually comes to feel with a quiet sense of vertigo, is that the Pompeians wrote about everything. The full range of human experience is represented on these walls, from the sublime to the scatological. There are passages of Virgil scratched by literate hands, lines from the Aeneid copied out, sometimes correctly and sometimes with charming errors, on the walls of private homes and public buildings. There are mathematical calculations, price lists, records of transactions. There are drawings, portraits, erotic scenes, crude caricatures of politicians and neighbours. There are magical incantations and religious dedications. There are insults so specific and personal that you can almost hear the quarrel that produced them. And there are, scattered throughout, those moments of naked human feeling, a declaration of love, a cry of loneliness, a boast that rings hollow across 2,000 years, that stop you in your tracks and make the distance between their world and ours collapse entirely. The scholarly study of these inscriptions has itself evolved dramatically over time. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the tendency was to treat the more informal graffiti as curiosities, amusing footnotes to the serious business of studying Roman history through its official monuments and literary texts. It was only in the latter half of the 20th century, as social history came to displace political and military history at the center of classical studies, that scholars began to recognize the graffiti as a resource of the first importance. Work by scholars including Antonio Varrone, whose meticulous surveys of erotic and amatory inscriptions opened new windows onto Roman sexuality and relationships, and Henrik Moritzen, whose analysis of electoral notices transformed understanding of Pompeian politics, demonstrated that the walls of this one city could illuminate entire dimensions. Could remilted people be illuminated? To Liminster and Strandstad, Gudenstrand in that Kali, but not Pat, Pax, Demisitits and Netsit to Kamexic to sit, and Klo to Wicketa to the, but with the but cloak with the app, with was put up quick up with that, up with the pap, with the hat, a god, to have the back, God, if this was looking at the More recently, the Ancient Graffiti Project, a digital humanities initiative led by Rebecca Benefiel of Washington and Lee University and co-directed with Holly Sipnowski, has created a searchable online database of all known handwritten inscriptions from Pompeii and Herculaneum, allowing scholars around the world to search, filter, and analyze the material in ways that would have been impossible for Zangermeister and his contemporaries. The project has revealed patterns invisible to the naked eye, clusters of inscriptions near particular types of establishment, correlations between the content of messages and their physical location in the city, evidence that certain walls functioned as habitual message boards while others were written on only rarely. Pompeii's walls, it turns out, were not a random surface for random expression. They were a structured, socially legible communication system, and we are only beginning to understand how it worked. And then there is the question of the date, the apparently settled historical fact that turns out to be anything but, for centuries. Scholars accepted the account given by Pliny the Younger, the Roman lawyer and writer who witnessed the eruption from across the bay and later wrote two famous letters describing it to the historian Tacitus. Pliny dated the eruption to the 9th day before the calends of September, which translates, in the modern calendar, to August 24th. This date became canonical. It appeared in every textbook, every documentary, every museum caption, but physical evidence from the site had long troubled scholars. The victims were found wearing heavier clothing, more consistent with autumn than high summer. The food preserved in the shops included autumnal produce, such as pomegranates, chestnuts, and dried figs. The wine jars from the most recent harvest were already sealed and labeled. In 2018, a team excavating in the previously unexcavated Reggio V sector of Pompeii found a charcoal inscription on the wall of a house under renovation. The inscription, casual, written in the kind of shorthand a workman might use to record the date, appeared to reference the 16th day before the calends of November, which would correspond to the 17th of October. If this date refers to the eruption, it pushes the event nearly 2 months later than Pliny's account suggests, reconciling the physical evidence beautifully, and reminding us that even the best documented catastrophe in antiquity is still capable of surprising us. That a single line of graffiti could overturn a date, accepted for centuries, tells you something profound about the power of what is written on these walls. This series will walk through that power chapter by chapter. We will spend time with the people who wrote on Pompeii's walls, not as abstractions or as representatives of historical categories, but as individuals, named and unnamed, whose words give us direct access to their inner lives. We will follow the love affairs recorded in plaster, the political campaigns plastered across entire city blocks, the gladiatorial celebrity culture shouted in charcoal, the religious yearning scratched near the city gates. We will sit in the thermopolia and read the complaints of dissatisfied customers. We will enter, carefully and with respect, the spaces where enslaved people left the only records they were allowed to make of their own existence. We will laugh, sometimes, because some of this writing is genuinely funny in a way that needs no translation, no footnote, no contextual apparatus, just a human being reading another human being's joke across a gap of 20 centuries. But we begin here, at the beginning, with a city that is still alive, still breathing, still writing on its walls. The sun is still climbing over Vesuvius, the bread is still warm, the city is talking, as it always talks, in 1,000 simultaneous voices. None of them know it is the last morning. None of them know that their words, scratched hastily into plaster, painted overnight by professional signwriters, carved slowly by hands that wanted to leave something behind, will survive when everything else is lost. Not the buildings, not the painted ceilings, not the human bodies themselves. The words will survive, the voices will be heard. And tonight, 2,000 years later, we are listening. Chapter 2, The Language of the Streets Who Wrote on the Walls, and Why There Is a Question That Any Thoughtful Person Asks, sooner or later, when they begin to read the graffiti of Pompeii. It is not a question about Latin grammar, or Roman history, or archaeological methodology. It is a much simpler, much more human question. Who were these people? Who actually picked up the stylus, dipped the brush, pressed the nail point to the soft plaster, and decided in the middle of an ordinary day, in a city that had no shortage of things to do, that they needed to write something on a wall? The answer, as the full sweep of Pompeian inscriptions reveals, is everyone, or very nearly everyone. And the implications of that answer are more interesting and more historically significant than they might at first appear. To understand why, we need to spend a moment with the question of literacy in the Roman world, a question that scholars have debated with considerable energy for several decades. The old assumption, inherited from a time when historians tended to focus on the literate elite and assume that everyone else was illiterate by default, was that reading and writing in the ancient world were restricted to a small, educated minority. The Roman Empire, on this account, was a primarily oral culture in which the vast majority of people, especially the poor, the enslaved, and women of all classes, could not read or write at all. The graffiti of Pompeii complicate this picture enormously. William Harris, in his landmark 1989 study Ancient Literacy, estimated that adult male literacy in the Roman world probably ran at around 20 to 30%, with much lower rates for women and the enslaved. But subsequent scholars, looking hard at the Pompeian evidence, have pushed back. The sheer number of inscriptions, more than 11,000 in a city of somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 people, suggests a culture in which the ability to read and write, even at a basic level, was far more widely distributed than Harris's figures implied. Nicholas Horsfall argued that Pompeii showed evidence of what he called functional literacy, the ability to read signs, notices, and short texts, even among people who could not compose elaborate prose. John Franklin's detailed analysis of the electoral notices demonstrated that the professional signwriters who painted them were working within a sophisticated system that assumed a reading public far larger than the educated elite. And then there are the graffiti themselves, not the painted electoral notices, which were produced by professionals, but the scratched and charcoal-written texts that anyone with a sharp implement and an available wall could produce. These range from the grammatically perfect and elegantly expressed to the barely decipherable and orthographically chaotic, and that range itself is enormously telling. A society in which only the educated elite were literate would produce graffiti of relatively uniform quality, the polished product of people trained in rhetoric and composition. What Pompeii's walls show instead is a gradient, texts that could have been written by schoolchildren practicing their letters, texts that bear the marks of competent but informal literacy, and texts that display genuine rhetorical sophistication. This is the literacy distribution you would expect in a society where reading and writing were taught at varying levels, quite broadly, not universally, but far more widely than the old model suggested. The tools of wall writing were various, and each left a different trace. The most common method for scratching inscriptions into plaster, the kind of text the Romans called a graffito, from the verb graffiare, to scratch, was a metal stylus, the same pointed implement used to write on wax tablets, which were the everyday writing surface of the Roman world, used for letters, accounts, shopping lists, and school exercises. A stylus pressed firmly against soft plaster could produce a clean, readable line, and the technique required no preparation, no ink, no special materials beyond the implement most literate Romans already carried as a matter of course. Many of Pompeii's scratched inscriptions show the fluid, continuous line of a practiced hand, someone who wrote quickly and confidently, as naturally as we type today. Charcoal was another common medium, leaving thick dark marks that could be read from some distance but were more vulnerable to weathering and wear. Many charcoal inscriptions have been lost even since excavation. The very act of exposing them to air and sunlight accelerated their decay, and early excavators often failed to record them before they faded. What survives is almost certainly a fraction of what once covered the walls. Red and black paint, applied with brushes, produced more durable texts. This was the medium favored for the electoral notices and commercial advertisements that required visibility and longevity, and which were generally produced not by private individuals but by professional signwriters working to commission. The existence of these professionals, called scriptors, in some ancient sources, is itself evidence of a lively market for public written communication. Where did people write? The short answer is, anywhere they could reach. The longer answer reveals something more structured and intentional. Studies of the spatial distribution of Pompeian graffiti have shown that inscriptions cluster in particular locations and are rare or absent in others. Busy thoroughfares attracted more writing than quiet backstreets. The areas around the city gates where travelers entered and exited, where people waited, where the foot traffic was at its densest, were covered in texts of every description. The forum, the amphitheatre, the bathhouses, the taverns, all were magnets for inscription. Private houses, by contrast, show much less writing on their exterior walls, though the interior walls of some houses are covered, particularly the rooms used by slaves and servants, and the spaces near doorways where passers-by could reach without needing to enter. The content of what was written was shaped by where it was written. Near the amphitheatre, the inscriptions are dominated by gladiatorial records and fan commentary. Near the forum, electoral notices crowd out almost everything else. In and around the taverns and inns, the texts are more personal names, declarations of feeling, complaints, boasts, jokes. In the covered walkways called portici, where people sheltered from rain and heat and stood waiting, the writing tends toward the contemplative and the literary lines of poetry, philosophical fragments, strings of names. The walls were not a blank canvas awaiting random expression. They were a structured communication environment, different zones serving different social functions, and the people writing on them understood this intuitively. It is worth pausing to consider what it felt like, from the inside, to live in a city so extensively covered in writing. We tend to think of graffiti as transgressive, as writing that appears where it shouldn't, in defiance of norms that disapprove of it. But the evidence from Pompeii suggests that much of the wall writing there was not transgressive at all. It was normal. It was, in many respects, expected. The electoral notices were painted with the cooperation, or at least the tolerance of the property owners on whose walls they appeared. The commercial advertisements represented a form of outdoor publicity that served everyone. Proprietors wanted their establishments known, and the city as a whole benefited from the information. Even the personal inscriptions, the love declarations, the jokes, the insults, seemed to have been produced in the full expectation that they would be read, discussed, and responded to. There is a metagraffito in Pompeii that makes this explicit. With a kind of weary self-awareness, that feels strikingly modern, scratched onto a wall in the basilica. It reads, "I am amazed, O wall, that you have not fallen in ruins, you who support the tedious scrawlings of so many writers. The voices unmistakably, doing exactly what they claim to find, so unmistakably, doing exactly it was stockly exactly be, going agate bass backing ghosty extakali secapalik leak so sikbakikis grog sai put leak subso papapo plawbob with the four wizard gate with that pusep with lit with sweat with back at up wap with pat you dot asa at us up back of at sa at back back gas got a full effect at a calf back west with us with the rest they were writing on the wall. Who, then, were the writers? We can begin with those whose identities are clearest, the producers of the electoral notices. These texts followed a remarkably consistent formula: candidate's name, office sought, desired virtues, and the names of the supporting group or individuals. Because the formula is standardized, the variation within it is all the more revealing. Supporters included trade guilds, the fullers, the bakers, the muleteers, the goldsmiths, as well as neighborhood associations, religious groups, and, fascinatingly, individual women. Women in Pompeii could not vote and could not stand for office, but they could and did publicly declare their support for candidates, and their names appear on the walls alongside those of male citizens, in a gesture of civic participation that the Roman system officially denied them but could not apparently prevent. A woman named Titia Secunda endorsed a candidate, so did a woman called Maria. These names, pressed into the wet paint of a campaign notice, are small acts of political existence in a world designed to make women politically invisible. The writers of the personal inscriptions are harder to pin down, because they identified themselves less reliably, sometimes giving a full name, sometimes a single name, sometimes no name at all. But the names that do appear represent a wide social cross-section. Roman names carried social information. A man with the full tria, noumena, prenomen, numen, cognomen, was a Roman citizen of some standing. A person identified by a single name, especially a Greek or Near Eastern name, was more likely to be a slave or a freed person. A significant proportion of the names in Pompeii's graffiti are single names, and many of those are Greek or Semitic in origin, suggesting that a considerable amount of the wall writing was produced by people of lower social status than the citizen body: freedmen, freed women, slaves, writing illicitly, immigrants and traders from across the Mediterranean world. This matters enormously. It means that Pompeii's walls preserve voices that the rest of Roman literary culture almost entirely excludes. Roman literature was produced by and for the educated elite. The historians, the poets, the philosophers, the orators, all wrote from within a narrow social band, and what they wrote reflected the perspectives, preoccupations, and prejudices of that band. The graffiti of Pompeii are different. They are the literature of everyone else, the people who did not write books, who did not compose speeches, who did not compose speeches, who did not correspond with emperors. They are the literature of the city, as it actually was, in all its noise and variety and mess. The physical act of writing on a wall also deserves consideration, because it was not always a hasty or impulsive act. Some of Pompeii's graffiti show clear evidence of care and deliberation. Multiple lines neatly aligned, letters of consistent size and spacing, texts that were clearly composed before being written rather than improvised on the spot. This is not the work of someone who paused for a moment between other tasks and scratched a quick thought. This is the work of someone who stood at a wall for an extended period of time, crafting a message they wanted to last. Other inscriptions are clearly quick and impulsive. A single word, a name, a number, scratched rapidly by someone with something immediately on their mind. The range of deliberateness mirrors the range of content. Some of what is written on these walls is carefully considered. Some of it is the verbal equivalent of a reflex. The question of audience is also worth dwelling on. When someone in Pompeii wrote on a wall, who did they expect to read it? In some cases, the answer is clear. The electoral notices were designed to be read by as many citizens as possible, which is why they appear on the most prominent and heavily trafficked walls. The commercial advertisements were similarly aimed at the broadest possible readership, but the personal inscriptions are more ambiguous. A declaration of love, scratched inside a tavern. Was it meant for the beloved, who might return to that tavern? For the other patrons, who would read it and perhaps gossip about it? For no one in particular, the act of writing being its own sufficient release. The answer probably varied from inscription to inscription, but the cumulative effect of all these messages, addressed to their various audiences and now read by us, is something like a public interior monologue, the private thoughts of a city made visible on its own skin. One more dimension of the writing culture of Pompeii deserves mention before we move deeper into the specific worlds: the graffiti reveal, the question of response and conversation. Many of Pompeii's inscriptions exist in dialogue with each other. One person writes something, another person, passing the same wall days or weeks later, adds a response. A declaration of love receives a mocking commentary. An electoral endorsement is defaced or countered with a rival endorsement. A boast is met with a deflating comeback. The walls of Pompeii were not a collection of isolated utterances, but an ongoing, layered, multi-authored text, more like a message thread than a broadcast. Scholars studying the spatial and temporal clustering of inscriptions have found evidence of these conversations playing out across months and years, as the walls accumulated their deposits of human expression layer by layer. This is, when you think about it, an astonishing thing. Nearly 2,000 years before anyone conceived of social media, the people of Pompeii were doing something that would be instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever read a comment thread. They were posting publicly, reading each other's posts, and replying. They were performing their identities for an audience. They were arguing, flirting, boasting, commiserating, and occasionally saying things they probably should have thought better of. The medium was different, plaster and metal rather than glass and electricity, but the impulse was identical. Human beings, it turns out, have always wanted to say something. They have always wanted to be heard, and if there is a wall nearby, they have generally been unable to resist the temptation of using it. Tonight, as we settle into this story, let that thought be the one that stays with you. Every inscription on every wall in Pompeii was produced by a person who wanted, in some way, to reach across time and space and make contact with another human being. Most of them never knew how well they would succeed. Most of them never imagined that their wall would still be standing 2,000 years later. Their words still legible, their voices still carrying, but they are, and we are listening. Chapter 3: Love, Longing, and Heartbreak Romance written in stone. Of all the things that Pompeii's walls say, the love inscriptions are perhaps the hardest to read without feeling something catch in your chest. Not because they are tragic, though sometimes they are, and not because they speak of a world impossibly remote from our own. Because they don't. They are hard to read, or rather hard to stop reading, because they are so nakedly, uncomplicatedly human. They are the words of people in the grip of a feeling that has changed, not at all in 20 centuries, using a vocabulary that is different from ours in every technical sense, and yet communicates with perfect clarity across the abyss of time. The Romans had a complex, layered vocabulary for love. They distinguished between amor, passionate, often physical love, frequently presented in Latin poetry as a kind of madness or affliction, and caritas, a more general term for affection and care, and amicitia, the deep bond of friendship between men that the Roman world valued as highly as any romantic attachment. The love graffiti of Pompeii draw on all of these registers, sometimes simultaneously. They range from the plainly physical to the achingly tender, from the triumphant to the desperate, and they involve people of every social station, citizens and freedmen, women and men, and, most movingly, slaves. Let us begin with the story that is the most complete, the most novelistic, the most perfectly preserved of all Pompeii's love dramas, a story told across 3 inscriptions on a single wall. A story involving 3 people whose names we know and whose feelings we can read as clearly as if they had been texted to us this morning. The wall in question is in the district around the Basilica, Pompeii's main public hall used for business and legal proceedings. Sometime before the eruption of 79 AD, a man named Successus, almost certainly a freedman, given his single Greek Roman name, scratched the following declaration onto the plaster: that he loved Iris, a slave girl who worked at a nearby inn, and that she did not care for him, but that he begged her to take pity on him. The full text, recorded as CIL 4, 8259, tells us everything we need to know. There is a man in the grip of unrequited love, and he has done what lovesick people throughout history have done. He has written it down somewhere, it might be seen. Perhaps he hoped Iris herself would see it. Perhaps he simply needed to put the feeling somewhere outside himself, to make it real by making it visible. What happened next is the part that takes your breath away. Another man, someone who knew Successus, or knew Iris, or simply passed by and read the declaration, added his own response directly below it on the same wall. This second writer gave his name as Severus, and what he wrote was a rebuke, roughly, that Successus was a fool, that Iris had no interest in him, and that he, Severus, was the one she actually liked. The details of the Latin are disputed. The text is damaged in places, but the social drama is unmistakable. Severus is taunting Successus, asserting a rival claim, doing the ancient equivalent of commenting on someone's public declaration of love, to say, "She's not into you, she's into me." And this is the moment when the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Successus wrote back. A third inscription, on the same wall, in what scholars have identified as the same hand as the first. Successus telling Severus, in terms that are robust even by the standards of Roman invective, to mind his own business. The argument played out on a wall in a Roman city in the 1st century AD, with precisely the dynamics of an argument played out on a social media platform today. Public, performative, addressed nominally to a specific person but actually aimed at anyone who happened to be watching, escalating through exactly the same stages of wounded pride and defensive aggression that such arguments have always followed. We do not know what happened to Successus and Severus and Iris. We do not know whether Iris ever read the inscriptions made in her name, or what she thought of them if she did. We do not know whether she was a real person or a fantasy, whether her relationship with Severus was as he implied or as invented as Successus's hope. We know only what was written on a wall, and that it was enough to make 3 people, their names and feelings, survive for 2,000 years. The love graffiti of Pompeii cover an enormous emotional range. At one extreme are the simple declarations, nothing more than a name and the Latin verb, amot, loves, paired with another name. These minimal texts are scattered throughout the city. Vibius loves Fortunata, Marcus loves Spendusa, Restitutus loves Martialis. They have the quality of whispered confidences pressed into stone, private feelings made fractionally public, the inscription itself a kind of prayer or wish. Some of them are playful rather than earnest, the ancient equivalent of writing a name inside a heart, the gesture of someone giddy with early love rather than tortured by its complications. At the other extreme are texts of genuine poetic ambition, compositions that clearly drew on the conventions of Latin love, elegy, the literary genre associated with poets like Ovid, Tibullus, and Propertius, in which the male poet constructed himself as the helpless slave of an indifferent and imperious beloved. One of the most celebrated examples from Pompeii is an inscription that adapts a formula from Propertius to express what seems to be a genuine, personal feeling, demonstrating that the inhabitants of this provincial city were not merely passive consumers of the literary culture of Rome, but active participants in it, capable of making it their own and bending it to their particular emotional needs. When a Pompeian scratched Propertian sentiment onto a tavern wall, they were claiming membership in a cultural conversation that extended far beyond the city's walls and back through centuries of Latin literary tradition. The physical locations of the love inscriptions are themselves revealing. Many of the most personal and emotionally intense declarations have been found not on the busy public thoroughfares where the electoral notices clustered, but in more intimate spaces, the back rooms of taverns, the covered walkways where people sheltered, the inner corridors of public buildings. This spatial distribution suggests a degree of intentionality, that the people writing love messages on walls were often choosing locations that felt, if not quite private, at least semi-private, places where the intended reader might plausibly be, or where the writer might feel somewhat shielded from public observation. The love graffiti occupy a middle space between the fully public and the fully private, as love itself so often does. The inscriptions also reveal something important about the social geography of romantic life in Pompeii. Roman society maintained rigid official hierarchies, citizens ranked above freedmen, freedmen above slaves, free persons of any description above enslaved persons. But the love graffiti demonstrate that these hierarchies were constantly and passionately transgressed in practice. Freedmen declared love for slave girls. Free women apparently attracted the attention of men well below their social station. The names that appear in the romantic inscriptions span the full social spectrum, and the pairings between names suggest relationships that would have been, in strictly legal terms, impossible or at least deeply irregular. Roman law did not recognize marriage between free persons and slaves, but Roman hearts apparently did not consult the law before making their decisions. The enslaved, in particular, deserve attention here, both as the objects of love declarations and, more fascinatingly, as the authors of them. We know that many of Pompeii's graffiti were written by enslaved people because the linguistic and epigraphic evidence points that way. Single, Greek, or Near Eastern names, certain syntactic patterns characteristic of people writing in Latin as a second language, and the physical locations of inscriptions in spaces predominantly occupied by slaves, kitchens, storage rooms, the service areas of large houses. When an enslaved person wrote a love inscription, they were performing an act that was in some sense doubly transgressive. They were claiming the right to feel and to express a feeling that the Roman legal system treated as incompatible with their status. A slave was property. Property could not love, could not grieve, could not long for another person. And yet they did, and they wrote about it, and the walls remembered. One of the most tender love inscriptions found in Pompeii belongs to this category. Its text, brief, almost grammatically elementary, records a feeling of missing someone who has gone away, using a construction that suggests either a child's writing or that of someone whose Latin was not their first language. The emotion it communicates is perfectly clear. I miss you. This person, writing in a second language, in a space where they were not supposed to be leaving personal records, wanted the world to know that they experienced absence and longing the way any human being does. The inscription is not famous. It does not appear in tourist guides to Pompeii. It is buried in Volume 4 of the CIL under a catalogue number, but it may be the most important thing on any of these walls, evidence that even in the most constrained and dehumanized of circumstances, human beings will find a way to say, I am here, I feel, I love. The love inscriptions also give us some of the most purely entertaining moments in the entire Pompeian record. Romans in love, like people in love everywhere and always, could be absurd, self-dramatizing, pompous, and oblivious, and the walls capture all of it. There is the unnamed admirer who writes, with magnificent confidence, that he is the most handsome man in Pompeii. There is the person who carefully records that a specific woman is beautiful, but also, in the same breath, notes that she is too expensive, a complaint that collapses the romantic and the financial with a casualness that feels entirely modern. There are the declarations that have clearly been edited, where an original text has been partially scratched out and amended, as if the writer thought better of their first draft and wanted to revise before publishing. The walls show us not just the finished declarations, but the process of composition, the second thoughts, the crossed-out words. The Roman literary tradition presented love as a disease, a madness, a combat, and the love graffiti of Pompeii sometimes echo this vocabulary, describing the writer as burning or dying for the beloved. But they also show a great deal of love that is warm rather than scorching, affectionate rather than tormented, content rather than anguished. There are inscriptions that read simply as expressions of happiness. This is a person who is loved and loves in return and wants to record that fact, to make the good feeling permanent by pressing it into the yielding plaster of a wall. These inscriptions are in some ways the most moving of all, because they are the record of joy rather than suffering, and because they remind us that what Vesuvius destroyed was not only a city of love and longing, but a city that also knew satisfaction and contentment and the quiet pleasure of a life that was, at least for some people some of the time, going well. We should spend a moment with the ways in which the love inscriptions illuminate Roman attitudes to gender and sexuality more broadly, because those attitudes were in some significant respects very different from modern Western norms. And reading the graffiti without acknowledging this difference would be a distortion. Roman sexuality was organized not primarily around the categories of heterosexual and homosexual, which are 19th century inventions, but around the categories of active and passive, with a strong social expectation that adult male citizens would always occupy the active position regardless of the gender of their partner. The love graffiti of Pompeii reflect this system. There are inscriptions expressing what we would today call same-sex desire, written in Latin that shows no consciousness of transgression. They are simply desire, named, declared, recorded. The transgression, in the Roman system, would have been located elsewhere, in questions of social status and civic role rather than biological sex. The women who appear in the love inscriptions are sometimes named, sometimes described, sometimes addressed in the second person, you, in a way that suggests the inscription was intended for their eyes, specifically. When women are named, the names are often significant. Fortunata, lucky; Primigenia, firstborn; Veneria, devoted to Venus; Iris, the rainbow messenger of the gods. These are names that tell stories about the circumstances of birth. about the aspirations of parents, about the divine associations claimed or assigned. Iris, the slave girl, beloved by successes, carries in her name the image of a rainbow, color and beauty, and the bridge between worlds. Whether the man who loved her thought of this, we cannot know, but it is there, in the name, on the wall, waiting. As you let this chapter settle into the quiet before sleep, consider what it means that in a city that has been dead for 2,000 years, we can still read the names of people who loved each other. Successes, Iris, Severus, they lived, they felt, they argued on a wall. And then the mountain came and their city disappeared, and for 17 centuries nobody read their names at all. And now we read them, and we know them, at least this much, that they were here, that they felt what we feel, that they wanted to be known. That desire to be known, to leave a mark, to say to the world, I was here and I felt this is perhaps the deepest thing the walls of Pompeii preserve. Not the politics, not the commerce, not even the humor, the love, the simple, ancient, indestructible human need to say, I love someone, and I want the world to know it. Chapter 4, The Ballot Walls Democracy, Roman Style. In the summer months before the eruption of Vesuvius, and remember, we now believe those months were in the year 79 AD, with the catastrophe itself arriving perhaps in October rather than August, the streets of Pompeii would have looked, to modern eyes, like nothing so much as the approach to a contested election anywhere in the democratic world today. The main thoroughfares, and many of the side streets, and the facades of shops and private houses and public buildings were covered in painted notices announcing the candidacies of men seeking elected office. The painted letters were large, often 8 to 12 centimeters high, and the texts were composed with the economy and punch of modern political slogans, designed to be read quickly by a citizen walking past on his way to the forum or the baths. Some walls bore a single notice, others bore 10 or 15. Overlapping and clustering, a palimpsest of civic ambition applied in layers over months and years. Walking down the Via dell'Abbondanza in the weeks before an election must have felt like walking through a city that was having an argument with itself about its own future, which is of course exactly what it was doing. The electoral notices of Pompeii, called programmata in the scholarly literature, from the Latin for a written public announcement, number well over 2,800 in the surviving record, making them the single most common category of inscription in the city. This is a remarkable statistic. It means that more than a quarter of everything ever written on Pompeii's walls was, in some sense, political. The city cared enormously about its elections. Its citizens, those of them at least, who had the right to vote, took the business of choosing their magistrates seriously, and the culture that had grown up around that business was as rich and complex, and sometimes as farcical as anything in modern democratic politics. The offices being contested were those of the local Roman municipal government. Pompeii, as a Roman colony, was governed by a set of elected magistrates who served one-year terms. The most senior were the two duumviri, a word meaning roughly men of two, a pair of annually elected chief magistrates who presided over the town council, administered justice, and oversaw the city's finances and public works. Below them were the two aediles magistrates responsible for the maintenance of public buildings, markets, weights and measures, and the organization of public games. These four officers were the top of the local political pyramid, and competition for them was fierce. Who could vote? Male Roman citizens of Pompeii, which, after the social war of 89 BC, meant virtually all free adult men born in the city or granted citizenship through the normal routes, including freedmen who had been manumitted by citizen masters. Women could not vote, slaves could not vote, resident foreigners could not vote. By modern standards, this is a severely restricted franchise, and we should be honest about that restriction rather than papering over it with romantic talk of Roman democracy. But within those restrictions, Pompeian political life was genuinely competitive and genuinely participatory. The elections mattered. The candidates campaigned in earnest, and the city's walls were the medium through which the campaigns were conducted. The format of the electoral notice was highly standardized, so standardized that scholars have been able to identify patterns that would be invisible in a less formulaic body of text. A typical notice reads something like, "His neighbors ask you to elect Marcus Epicdius Sabinus as duumvir with judicial power. He is worthy," or "The goldsmiths unanimously ask you to elect Gaius Cuspius Pansa as aedile." The formula always includes the candidate's name, the office sought, and the name of the supporting individual or group. and it almost always concludes with a brief evaluative phrase: "He is worthy, a good man, deserving of public office," that functions as both endorsement and character reference. Within this formula, the variations are endlessly revealing. The supporting groups named in the notices constitute a remarkable social census of Pompeian associational life. Trade guilds feature prominently: the fullers who cleaned cloth, the bakers who supplied the city's bread, the muleteers who moved its goods, the fruit sellers, the barbers, the goldsmiths, the innkeepers. Religious associations groups dedicated to the worship of particular deities or the practice of particular cultic rites also appear as endorsers. Neighborhood associations, organized around particular streets or districts, endorsed candidates alongside the trade groups. And, consistently fascinating to scholars, individual women appear among the endorsers, sometimes named, sometimes described only by their relationship to a male citizen, but unmistakably present as political actors in a system that formally excluded them from the vote. The appearance of women as endorsers of political candidates in Pompeii has generated considerable scholarly discussion. In strict Roman constitutional terms, women had no political voice. They could not vote, could not stand for office, could not address the assembly. And yet here they are, on the walls of the city, putting their names or the names that identified them in the public record behind candidates, and implicitly staking a claim to civic existence. What did it mean? Several interpretations have been proposed. One is purely practical. The endorsement of a woman might carry weight because of her family connections, her wealth, or her social influence in a neighborhood where she was well known and respected. Another interpretation sees the endorsements as evidence of a gap between formal constitutional rules and informal social reality, a gap that appears frequently in the study of women's lives in the Roman world, where official exclusion and practical participation coexisted in ways the formal sources rarely acknowledge. A third interpretation, offered by some scholars, is that the women who endorsed candidates were not simply exceeding the formal bounds of their role, but actively contesting them, using the wall, the most public of media, to make a claim for political relevance that the assembly would not recognize. On this reading, every female endorsement is a small act of political assertion. I exist, I have opinions, my opinion matters. This may be to read too much intentionality into what were partly conventional gestures, but it is not entirely fanciful. The women of Pompeii were not passive. They ran businesses, they owned property, they wrote on walls, they made their presence felt. The men who stood as candidates were, for the most part, drawn from Pompeii's local elite, the families who had been prominent in the city for generations and who had the wealth and connections to sustain a political career. But the world of Pompeian politics was not entirely closed to social mobility. Freed slaves and their descendants could and did participate in civic life, and the names of freedmen appear in the political record in ways that suggest they were significant actors rather than marginal ones. The Augustals, a quasi-official body of wealthy freedmen who paid for public spectacles and religious ceremonies in exchange for a kind of honored status that compensated for their inability to hold full civic office, were major patrons of public life in Pompeii, and their economic power gave them considerable informal political influence even without formal political influence, even without formal political influence, even without formal plet. Informant, with our formant plafinert, with this fornet, bilk, placeb, clepiment, bat, with ipsob, and with emit quirk, with a pledkin and witman, with that begin of dim, but bat, with ats, but that back up, perhaps, but up, the pack afka, yidak, gaf, bear, I would put gakkult kappa, that bef, why because cask, go dirt, the mert, go of move, just the stoops, The mechanics of the campaigns conducted through these wall notices are surprisingly sophisticated when examined closely. The professional signwriters who painted the notices, we know from the graffiti themselves that some were named. Emilius Sella and Infancio, among others, were not simply copying out a standardized text on commission. They were making choices about placement, about prominence, about the order in which to present information. A notice painted at eye level on a high-traffic corner was worth more than the same text tucked away on a side wall. A notice painted in large, bold letters over a faded older notice asserted priority and freshness. The competition for wall space in the weeks before an election must have been intense, and the signwriters, who were often working late at night to apply their painted notices while the plaster was still workable, were strategic actors in the campaign, not merely its artisans. There is one extraordinary piece of meta-commentary on this process preserved on a Pompeian wall. A scratched inscription that names a specific signwriter and accuses him of painting campaign notices while drunk. The inscription, brief, pointed, and clearly written by someone who found this amusing or scandalous, is a reminder that the people involved in political campaigns were human beings with all the human foibles that implies, and that the city watched them with the same mixture of interest and amusement that citizens have always brought to the spectacle of political competition. What did the elections actually decide? This is worth examining, because the offices being contested in Pompeii's elections were not merely ceremonial. The duumviri and aediles exercised real power over the daily life of the city. They heard legal disputes and issued judgments. They supervised the market and punished merchants who cheated on weights and measures. They were responsible for maintaining the roads, the fountains, the public latrines, and the temples. They organized the public games, the gladiatorial shows, the theatrical performances, the beast hunts that were central to Pompeian social life, and that a magistrate was expected to fund substantially from his own pocket in a custom called euergetism, the competitive generosity of the wealthy, who paid for public pleasure in exchange for public honor. This system of euergetism explains something that initially puzzles modern readers of the electoral notices: the fact that many candidates appear to be advertising not just their candidacy but their past generosity, reminding voters of games they have funded or buildings they have paid for. In Roman political culture, this was not considered improper. Quite the contrary, it was the expected basis of political claims. A man who had spent heavily on public spectacle was demonstrating that he was the kind of person who would continue to benefit the city from his private resources, and voters had every reason to prefer such a person over one who had been stingy. The electoral notices thus often functioned simultaneously as political advertisements and as receipts, evidence of investments already made in the city's pleasure and well-being. The content of the endorsements also illuminates the social networks within which Pompeian politics operated. When the muleteers collectively endorsed a candidate, they were signaling to other voters, perhaps especially to people who depended on the muleteer trade, that this candidate was their man. When a neighborhood association endorsed someone, they were mobilizing the social ties and mutual obligations of a defined community around a political preference. The genius of the programmata system was that it made these networks visible. It turned the invisible web of social obligation and loyalty that underpinned all political behavior into something legible, painted large on the city's most public surfaces. Perhaps the most humanizing aspect of the electoral notices is the occasional hint of the pressures and anxieties that accompanied the process of democratic competition. There is at least one inscription that appears to record a candidate's promise of a specific political favor in return for support, a hint of the deal-making and negotiation that surely accompanied every election campaign behind the scenes. There are notices that appear to have been defaced or counter-endorsed by opponents, evidence of the competitive tensions that could turn the passive medium of a painted wall into an active battleground. And there are notices so formulaic, so blanket in their praise, that they read as the ancient equivalent of a campaign robocall endorsements of such generic enthusiasm that they could have applied to any candidate in any city, produced by someone who owed a duty of support but was perhaps not deeply moved by the particular individual they were nominally promoting. Reading the electoral notices in the full context of everything else on Pompeii's walls is a corrective to the idealization of Roman political culture that sometimes creeps into popular accounts of the ancient world. The Romans who voted in Pompeii's elections were not philosopher kings contemplating the common good in serene deliberation. They were people with interests, loyalties, obligations, and grievances. People who voted for the man who had funded good games, or the man whose family had long connections in their neighborhood, or the man whose trade guild was allied with their own. They were, in other words, voters. Recognizably, unchangingly, admirably, and frustratingly human voters. The ballot walls of Pompeii tell us that the experience of democratic politics, its enthusiasms and its cynicism, its genuine civic feeling and its tactical calculation, was not invented in modernity. It is as old as the city itself. As you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine those walls in the weeks before the last election Pompeii ever held, whenever that was, in 79 AD, in the final months of the city's life. The signwriters at work in the early hours of the morning, their torches casting flickering shadows on the wet plaster. The candidates asleep, or perhaps unable to sleep, their futures balanced on the preferences of thousands of fellow citizens, the city breathing around them, the mountains silent above, and on every available surface, the conversation the city was having with itself about who should lead it, who deserved its trust, who had earned the right to sit in the seat of honor and speak in its name. None of them would ever know who won. Chapter V. Bread, wine, and the thermopolium, the food stalls of the ancient world. If you were to arrive in Pompeii on any ordinary morning in the years before the eruption, hungry from the road and looking for somewhere to eat, you would not struggle to find options. Quite the opposite. Step through any of the city's 7 gates, begin walking toward the Forum along any of the major streets, and within minutes you would pass a thermopolium, then another, then another. They are everywhere. L-shaped counters of masonry built flush against the street, their smooth stone surfaces inlaid with large circular terracotta jars called dolia, each jar sunk into the counter and filled with something edible or drinkable: grain, legumes, wine, olive oil, prepared stews, sauces, honeyed drinks. The counters face the street, open to the world, and behind them stand the proprietors, men and women, free and enslaved, ready to ladle out whatever you want and take your coin in return. Archaeologists have identified more than 150 thermopolia in Pompeii, an astonishing density for a city of its size. The word itself comes from the Greek, thermos, warm or hot, plus polein, to sell. It means, quite literally, a place where hot things are sold. The equivalent in modern culinary terminology might be a street food counter, or a fast food outlet, or a canteen, but none of these translations quite captures the social function that the thermopolium served in the Roman world, which was significantly broader than mere eating. To understand why thermopolia were so central to Pompeian life, you have to understand a fact about Roman domestic architecture that surprises most modern visitors. The majority of Pompeii's urban population did not cook at home, not because they lacked the desire or the skill, but because they lacked the facilities. Most of the city's residents lived not in the large private houses domos, with their elaborate courtyards and kitchens and dining rooms, but in much smaller dwellings, rented rooms above shops, subdivided houses, apartment-like spaces in multi-tenanted buildings that had no cooking facilities at all. Cooking with open fire in a confined and densely built urban space was genuinely dangerous. Pompeii, like Rome itself, suffered from the constant threat of fire, and the practical alternative for the majority of the population was to eat out, every day, for every meal. The thermopolium was not a luxury or an occasional indulgence. For most Pompeians, it was the kitchen. What did they eat? The surviving thermopolia give us extraordinary evidence. In several that have been excavated with modern archaeological precision, the dolia still contain traces of their last contents, carbonized remains that chemists and food historians have been able to analyze. The results are a window into the Roman diet in thrilling detail. A thermopolium excavated in the Reggio V sector of Pompeii in recent years. Its excavation, reported in 2020 as one of the most complete ever undertaken, yielded traces of duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, beef, and various legumes, along with evidence of fermented fish sauce and wine. This was not the bland, monotonous diet that a diet of poverty might have produced. It was varied, protein-rich, and seasoned with the condiments that were fundamental to Roman cooking: garum fermented fish sauce, honey, olive oil, and wine. The walls of the thermopolia and the streets immediately surrounding them are rich with graffiti, and those inscriptions are among the most vivid and immediate in all of Pompeii, because they were written by the customers. And what customers write about is their experience. They write about what they ate, what they paid, who served them, and most entertainingly, when things went wrong. The complaints that appear on and around Pompeii's eating establishments are recognizable to anyone who has ever left an angry review online. The service was slow, the wine was watered, the host was rude, the bed was damp, the chamber pot was missing. These are not the dignified complaints of the literary elite, but the raw, immediate frustrations of people who felt they had paid good money for a service that had failed them. The most celebrated of the complaint inscriptions is CIL 4, 4957, found near an inn, in which a guest records that he and his companions wet the bed during the night and assigns the blame squarely to the host for providing no chamber pot. The text is brief, matter of effort, and entirely unembarrassed. The writer seems genuinely more aggrieved at the inconvenience than mortified by the confession. which tells us something interesting about Roman attitudes to bodily functions and social propriety. What strikes the modern reader is the combination of the personal and the public. This is intimate information, recorded in a medium designed to be read by everyone who passed. The inscription functions as both a grievance and a warning to future travelers: stay elsewhere, or at least come prepared. The social world of the Thermopolium was, in important respects, a world turned upside down. In the formal hierarchies of Roman society, the world of the forum and the basilica, and the political assemblies, social rank determined almost everything. Who spoke, who sat where, who was served first, whose opinion carried weight. In the Thermopolium, those hierarchies were partially suspended. Rich and poor ate side by side at the same counter. Citizens and freedmen and slaves, those slaves who had been sent out to fetch food for their households, occupied the same physical space. Women, who in the formal social world of Roman life were often segregated and constrained, were present in Thermopolia, both as proprietors and as customers. The counter was a democratic space in the most literal sense, not in the constitutional sense, which applied to the forum, but in the social sense, the sense of people from different walks of life, sharing the same physical experience. This social mixing is reflected in the graffiti of the eating establishments. The names that appear in inscriptions on and near Thermopolia come from every social stratum. Proprietors' names, sometimes advertised on painted signs outside the establishment, are often Greek or Semitic, suggesting that many of the people who ran these businesses were freed persons or descendants of freed persons, since such names were common among the formerly enslaved. This is not surprising. The restaurant trade, like many forms of commerce in the Roman world, was a path of economic advancement for freed persons, who often had access to capital accumulated during or after their enslavement, and the commercial networks necessary to run a successful business, but who faced social obstacles in the more prestigious occupations associated with the citizen elite. The most elaborately preserved Thermopolium in Pompeii is the one now known as the Thermopolium of Lucius Veranius, Hypsæus, named for an inscription found on its premises. Located on the Via dell'Abbondanza, it is a textbook example of the type, an L-shaped masonry counter. Multiple dolia, a painted frieze of images above the counter, probably depicting the menu or the establishment's specialties. A small back room for storage, and a larger space possibly used for seated dining. The images on the painted frieze include depictions of animals: a rooster, a mallard, a dog, which may have been advertisements for the meats on offer, or may have had a protective, apotropaic function, or both. The proprietor's name appears in an inscription that identifies the establishment and, perhaps, serves as a kind of brand identity. This is Hypsæus's place, and Hypsæus is a known quantity in the neighborhood. Beyond the physical evidence of the Thermopolia themselves, the graffiti of the surrounding streets preserve traces of the commercial culture in which they operated. There are inscriptions recording prices, sometimes specific to particular items, sometimes apparently recording the outcome of a transaction. There are texts that seem to record the names of regular customers, or perhaps the names of those who owed money. There are advertisements for particular products: wine of a specific vintage, oil from a named supplier, the superior quality of one establishment's garum, that read exactly like modern commercial boasts. The world of Roman food commerce was intensely competitive, and competition expressed itself, as it always does, in claims of superiority delivered in the most public venue available. Wine deserves particular attention in this context, because it occupied a place in Roman daily life that has no precise equivalent in modern experience. Romans drank wine with virtually every meal, diluted with water to varying degrees depending on the time of day, the occasion, and one's wealth, but always present. Pure, undiluted wine was considered the mark either of the very wealthy or of the dangerously intemperate. The Thermopolia served wine as a matter of course, and the quality and provenance of the wine on offer was a significant element of an establishment's reputation. Several Pompeian inscriptions record the specific origins of wines: Campanian, Falernian, the most prestigious Italian wine of the period, wines from the Greek islands, in terms that suggest customers were making informed choices rather than simply consuming whatever was poured. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the Worcestershire sauce of the ancient world. The condiment that found its way into virtually every Roman dish was produced commercially in Pompeii itself, and the evidence of its production is scattered throughout the city. The smell of garum production is often described in ancient sources as powerful and unpleasant, and the industry was typically located on the edges of towns rather than in the residential center. Pompeii had garum factories near the town walls, and their products bottled in the distinctive amphorae, whose painted labels recorded the type of fish used, the grade of the sauce, and the name of the producer, were exported throughout the Roman world. Finding a Pompeian garum amphora in Spain or Britain or the Rhineland is not unusual. The city was, among other things, a significant commercial producer of this essential condiment, and the thermopolia that served Pompeii's residents were the end of a commercial chain that reached across an empire. The bread that was sold in and around Pompeii's thermopolia came from the city's many bakeries. Around 30 have been identified, which is again a remarkable density. The bakery of Modestus, near the Stabian Baths, is perhaps the most evocative. It still contains the millstones used to grind the grain, the domed oven, and, most hauntingly, 81 carbonized loaves of bread, preserved in the exact positions in which they were placed when the eruption came. Each loaf is stamped with the bakery's mark, a commercial practice designed to deter theft in the busy streets where bread was transported and sold. The stamps on Roman bread are themselves a form of graffiti. The baker's mark pressed into the dough is a signature, an assertion of identity and ownership, a claim of authorship over a loaf of bread that would be eaten within hours but that has, by the strange alchemy of volcanic preservation, lasted 2,000 years. The people who ate at Pompeii's thermopolia and wrote on their walls were not thinking about history. They were hungry, or thirsty, or tired from the day's work, or meeting a friend, or conducting a transaction, or simply stopping for a moment in the current of daily life to eat something warm and record something true. The man who complained about the missing chamber pot was not composing for posterity. The customer who scratched the price of his meal next to his name was keeping a private record, not imagining an audience of future historians. And yet these small acts, the complaint, the notation, the name scratched into plaster, are now the most direct evidence we have of what daily life felt like from the inside, in a Roman provincial city, at the height of the empire's prosperity. When we read the food inscriptions of Pompeii, we are reading the record of a society that had solved the problem of how to feed a large urban population and that had developed, around that solution, a rich social culture, the culture of the counter and the cup, of the standing meal and the shared wine, of the proprietor known by name and the regular customer whose preferences were anticipated. This is not the Rome of triumphs and emperors and philosophical dialogues. This is Rome as most Romans experienced it: a bowl of lentils, a cup of watered wine, a joke about last night's accommodation, and the endless, sustaining, ordinary pleasure of being fed. Chapter 6. The arena speaks gladiators as celebrities. There is a wall in Pompeii, not far from the amphitheater, on which someone scratched a name so many times, and with such evident enthusiasm, that the plaster around it became almost unreadable beneath the accumulated devotion. The name is Celadus. He is described, in various inscriptions clustered around the gladiatorial district of the city, as a Thracian, one of the recognized fighting styles of the Roman arena, characterized by a curved short sword called a sica and a small round shield, and as a man of outstanding accomplishment in his profession. He is also described, in a phrase that has delighted classicists ever since it was first transcribed, as the heartthrob of the girls, suspirium puellirum in Latin, literally, the sigh of the girls. 3 fights, 3 victories. The heartthrob of the girls. Celadus is not a character from a novel. He is not a figure from mythology or legend. He was a real man who lived in Pompeii in the 1st century AD, who fought in the amphitheater for the entertainment of the crowd, and who inspired in at least some portion of that crowd a level of adoration that his fans felt compelled to record on every available surface. He is, in other words, a celebrity, and his celebrity operated through mechanisms that are, in their essentials, entirely familiar to the modern world: public performance, a devoted fan base, the media of the day, which happened to be walls, and a personal mythology built around physical prowess and physical beauty in roughly equal measure. The gladiatorial inscriptions of Pompeii, there are hundreds of them, spread across the city but concentrated particularly in the area around the amphitheater and the gladiators. Barracks constitute one of the most vivid and unexpected archives in the entire Pompeian record. They tell us things about Roman popular culture that no literary source confirms, because the literary sources are almost entirely written by educated men who treated the arena with a mixture of fascination and aristocratic disdain, who could not entirely resist the spectacle, but who were embarrassed by their inability to resist it. The graffiti have no such ambivalence. They are the record of the crowd, pure and unmediated. The crowd that loved the arena, that memorized the fighters' records, that fell for particular athletes the way modern fans fall for particular players, and that scratched their devotion into every wall within reach. To understand the gladiatorial inscriptions, we need to spend a moment with the institution of the arena itself, and with what it actually meant in the social and emotional life of a city like Pompeii. The gladiatorial games, munera in Latin, meaning gifts or duties, the term reflecting their origin as funeral offerings provided to honor the dead, were not peripheral entertainments in the Roman world. They were central. They were among the most important social events in the calendar of any Roman city, occasions when the entire community gathered in a single space and shared an experience that was simultaneously spectacle, ritual, political performance, and collective emotional release. The magistrates who organized and funded the games were exercising one of the most significant of all civic functions. The crowd that attended them was enacting one of the most important of all civic rituals, the communal expression of Roman values, courage, strength, endurance, the willingness to face death with composure. Pompeii had one of the oldest amphitheaters in the Roman world. It dates to around 70 BC, predating the Great Colosseum in Rome by more than a century. It could hold approximately 20,000 spectators, which means that during a major show it contained something approaching the entire population of the city, plus visitors from the surrounding region who came specifically for the games. The amphitheater was not just a venue. It was the largest single gathering space in Pompeii, the place where the city came together most completely. The arena, literally, the sand on which the most intense dramas of Pompeian public life played out. The fighters who performed in this arena were, in legal terms, among the lowest members of Roman society. Many were enslaved. Others were convicts, sentenced to the arena as a form of capital punishment, given in a particularly Roman paradox, a chance at survival in exchange for becoming entertainment for the crowd. Some were free volunteers, men who chose the gladiatorial life for the money and the excitement, contracting with laniste, gladiatorial trainers and agents, and accepting the infamia, the legal and social disgrace, that came with the profession. In theory, the gladiator stood outside respectable Roman society. In practice, the gladiator stood at the very center of Roman popular culture, celebrated, idolized, and desperately mourned by the fans who loved him. The gladiators' barracks in Pompeii, a large colonnaded building near the large theater, used in its final phase as a barracks for the gladiatorial troupe that performed at the amphitheater, has yielded some of the most extraordinary inscriptions in the city. The walls of its porticos and rooms are covered in the writing of the men who lived there. Names, records of fights and victories, declarations of feeling, drawings of weapons and armor, and the faces of fighters. These are the words of the gladiators themselves, or at least of the people who lived in close proximity to them, and reading them produces a powerful sensation of vertigo, because you are reading words written by men who lived with the daily knowledge that their profession might kill them, who faced that knowledge with what seems to have been a remarkable equanimity, and who chose, in their moments of reflection, to write on the walls. The records of individual fighters are the most immediately striking of the barracks inscriptions. They follow a format that will be familiar to any sports fan: fighter's name, fighting style, number of bouts, record of wins and draws. Celadus, the Thracian, 3 fights, 3 victories. Crescens, the net fighter, Arisiorius, who fought with a trident and a weighted net. Various records across various inscriptions that appear to track his career. Felix the Thracian, Oceanus the freedman. These men's careers were documented on the walls with the statistical precision of a modern sports archive, because the crowd cared intensely, personally, about those statistics. They remembered them, they discussed them, they used them as the basis for the betting that was an integral part of the spectacle. The betting on gladiatorial contests is attested throughout the Pompeian record, and some of the inscriptions connected to the arena appear to be records of wagers made or settled. Romans bet on gladiatorial contests with the same enthusiasm and the same obsessive attention to form and record that modern gamblers bring to horse racing or football. And the wall of a tavern near the amphitheater was as natural a place to record a bet as the back of a race card. The gladiatorial inscriptions thus exist in a broader commercial and social context. They are part of an economy of excitement that extended from the arena itself through the taverns and streets of the surrounding neighborhood, connecting the spectacle to the daily lives of the city in ways that blurred the line between entertainment and ordinary experience. The fan culture documented in the Pompeian Graffiti is, in its essentials, identical to modern fan culture. There are the devotees who record every fight, every result, every detail of a favored fighter's career. There are the rivalries between fans of different fighters or different gladiatorial schools. The collegium, or troupe, to which a gladiator belonged, could inspire loyalty comparable to that which modern fans feel for their clubs. There is the objectification of gladiators as physical ideals, the repeated descriptions of fighters as handsome, as beloved of women, as objects of desire, that places the gladiatorial body in a cultural context of physical admiration that is both straightforwardly aesthetic and obliquely erotic. And there are the mourning inscriptions, texts that record the death of a favorite fighter with a grief that reads as entirely genuine, a sorrow that no amount of historical distance makes it comfortable to dismiss as mere entertainment. One of the most moving categories of gladiatorial inscription is precisely this last one, the memorial. When a gladiator died in the arena, or perhaps more commonly, from the infections and injuries that accumulated over a career of violent combat, those who mourned him sometimes wrote on walls, not always in the formal commemorative tradition of funerary inscription, with its set phrases and measured grief, but in the rougher, more immediate language of personal loss. One inscription near the gladiator's barracks commemorates a fighter with language that expresses genuine sorrow, noting his victories and his qualities in terms that go beyond the formulaic. The writer, possibly a fellow fighter, possibly a fan, possibly someone who had simply known the man, wanted the world to know that this particular person had existed and had been remarkable. The relationship between gladiators and women is one of the most discussed aspects of the arena culture, and the Pompeian evidence gives it a dimension that no purely literary source provides. The literary tradition, written by men who simultaneously disapproved of and were fascinated by the arena, frequently asserts that Roman women were dangerously attracted to gladiators, that the combination of physical prowess, social marginality, and the glamour of mortal danger made gladiators irresistible to women who should have known better. This is partly a rhetorical trope, deployed in moralizing texts to condemn both the arena and the women who admired it, but the graffiti suggests it was also, at least in part, true, or at least that the gladiators' reputation as objects of female admiration was real and widely accepted in Pompeii. The inscriptions describing Celadus as the sigh of the girls, and similar descriptions of other fighters, are not written by disapproving moralists but by fans, probably including female fans, who are celebrating the very quality that the literary sources condemn. This is Roman popular culture in one of its most unguarded moments, expressing a preference that polite literature preferred to pathologize. The women who wrote or dictated these inscriptions were not embarrassed by their admiration. They put it on the wall. The social world of the gladiatorial inscriptions also intersects with questions of slavery and freedom in ways that are both historically significant and personally affecting. Many of Pompeii's gladiators were enslaved, and their professional identities, their fighting names, their records, their public personas existed in a complex relationship with their legal identities as property. The fighting name was often different from whatever name a man had been given at birth or in slavery. It was a professional identity constructed for the arena, sometimes carrying associations of strength or danger. Oceanus, the boundless sea; Felix, the lucky one; Celadus, the famous one. To have your fighting name scratched admiringly on the walls of the city in which you fought was, in some sense, to have a public existence that your legal status denied you, a form of fame that transcended the category of slave, or freedman, or convict, and existed in a purely popular, purely performative space. This is, when you follow it to its conclusion, a remarkable thing. The Roman system of slavery was designed to render the enslaved invisible as persons, to make them legally equivalent to tools, to deny them the status of human beings with histories, feelings, and futures. The gladiatorial culture, in its popular manifestation, worked in precisely the opposite direction. It took men at the very bottom of the social hierarchy and made them into icons, gave them names that reverberated across the city, inspired devotion that outlasted their careers and sometimes their lives. The gladiatorial inscriptions of Pompeii are thus, among many other things, a record of the persistent human tendency to create celebrity, to identify particular individuals as exceptional, to project onto them the full force of collective admiration, and to make them, however briefly, and however paradoxically, the most famous people in the citadel. As you settle into the quiet of this night, let the image stay with you. A young man in the arena, the crowd of 20,000 roaring around him, the sand white beneath his feet. He fights well, he wins, and somewhere in that crowd, someone is already composing the inscription they will scratch on the wall on the way home, noting his name, his record, his fighting style, and the fact that the girls all sigh for him. He will probably never read it. He will fight again next month, and perhaps the month after that, and perhaps he will die before he ever knows that his name is everywhere on the walls of this city. But it will be there. It will still be there when the mountain comes and the city ends. Celadus the Thracian, 3 fights, 3 victories, the heartthrob of the girls, still the heartthrob, 2,000 years later, of anyone who reads his name on a wall. Chapter 7. The enslaved and the free voices from the margins of Roman society. There is a particular kind of silence in history, not the silence of things that were never said, but the silence of things that were said and then deliberately, systematically unheard. The silence of those whose words were never considered worth recording, whose inner lives were never considered worth documenting, whose existence was acknowledged only in the ledgers of ownership and the casualty lists of war. This is the silence that surrounds the enslaved in almost every written record the ancient world has left us. Roman literature, vast, sophisticated, rich in the textures of daily life at its upper levels, is essentially mute on the subject of what it felt like to be a slave. The enslaved appear in it as background figures, comic characters, convenient narrative devices, moral cautionary tales. They do not, as a rule, speak. Pompeii's walls are different, not because the enslaved were given a voice by the structures of Roman society. They were not, and we should be clear about that from the beginning, but because the walls were, in a crucial sense, ungoverned. No one issued permits for wall writing, no one reviewed the contents of a scratched inscription before it appeared on the plaster. The wall was public and permanent and visible to everyone, but the act of writing on it required only a sharp implement and a moment of privacy, and both of those things were, sometimes, available even to those whom Roman law considered property rather than persons. What the enslaved wrote on Pompeii's walls, they wrote without permission. They wrote because the wall was there, and because the need to write, to leave a mark, to say something, to be known, is apparently more fundamental to human nature than any legal category has ever been able to suppress. To read these inscriptions with the attention they deserve, we must first spend some time understanding what slavery actually meant in 1st century Pompeii, because Roman slavery was not identical in its structures or its experience to the more familiar chattel slavery of the early modern world, and collapsing them together would distort both. Roman slavery was an enormously varied institution. At one end of the spectrum were those whose experience of enslavement was one of extreme physical brutality, agricultural slaves working in chain gangs on large rural estates, or the men condemned to the mines, whose life expectancy was measured in months and whose labor was extracted under conditions of deliberate dehumanization. These people, if they wrote on walls at all, left no surviving record. At the other end of the spectrum were the household slaves of urban families, slaves who worked as secretaries, accountants, tutors, doctors, cooks, and personal attendants in the homes of Pompeii's middle and upper classes. Their physical conditions were, in many cases, considerably better than those of free poor people living outside the household. They might be educated. Some owners invested in the education of slaves they planned to use in skilled roles. They moved through the city on their owner's business, carrying messages, making purchases, transacting commercial affairs. They were present in the streets, the markets, the bathhouses, the taverns, and they were literate, at least in significant numbers, because their usefulness to their owners often depended precisely on their ability to read and write. It is from this middle range of urban household slavery that most of the slave-authored graffiti in Pompeii appear to come. The evidence for their authorship is necessarily indirect. No inscription announces itself as having been written by an enslaved person, for obvious reasons, but scholars have developed a range of methods for identifying probable slave authorship. Single names of Greek or Near Eastern origin are one indicator. Greek names were so strongly associated with slavery and freed person status in Roman Italy that a Greek-named author of a wall inscription was, statistically, far more likely to be enslaved or formerly enslaved than freeborn. Certain grammatical patterns characteristic of non-native Latin speakers are another indicator. Since many enslaved people in Roman Italy were originally from the Greek-speaking East and wrote Latin as a second language, The physical locations of inscriptions, found in kitchen areas, storage rooms, and service corridors, rather than in the public-facing spaces of houses, provide a third form of evidence. When you combine all three indicators and look at what emerges, you find a body of writing that is, in its emotional texture, quite distinct from much of the rest of the Pompeian record. The love declarations of freedmen and citizens often have a performative quality. They are written to be seen, to be admired, to project an identity onto the public record. The inscriptions that appear to come from enslaved hands tend to be quieter, more inward, as if written for an audience of one, or perhaps for no audience at all, the writing itself being sufficient. They are notes pressed into the walls of spaces where an enslaved person might spend time alone: the kitchen while the household slept, the storage corridor while waiting for an errand to begin, the back room of a tavern during a quiet hour. One of the most affecting is a brief text found in the service area of a private house, whose author gives a single name, probably the name assigned in slavery rather than a birth name, since Roman slaves were renamed by their owners, and records the simple fact of missing someone who has gone. The Latin is elementary, the feeling is not. The person who wrote it understood, precisely and without any need of elaboration, that the experience of separation from someone loved was worth recording, was worth pressing into the wall of a house that did not belong to them, in a city where they had no legal standing as a person. They wrote it anyway, the wall held it, and now we read it. The inscription, recorded as CIL 4, 1852, belongs to this emotional register, though its authorship is debated. It reads, in paraphrase, as Pyrrhus addressing his companion, Caius, "I grieve because you have been taken from me." The Latin word used for being taken, the passive construction, the sense of removal imposed from outside, rather than chosen, carries within it the entire world of enslaved experience. People in slavery were taken from their families, their homes, their communities, their languages, their names, taken from each other. When an owner decided that two people who had formed a bond should be separated, sold to different households, sent to different cities, divided by a transaction that treated their relationship as incidental to the economic calculation at stake. The grief in Pyrrhus's inscription is the grief of someone who knows that the people he loves can be removed from his life by a decision he had no part in making and no power to contest. That this grief was expressed on a wall, publicly, permanently, in Latin that any literate passerby could read, is itself an act of resistance, though we should be careful about projecting too heroic a narrative onto what may have been simply an instinctive human response to pain. The enslaved people who wrote on Pompeii's walls were not necessarily thinking about defying the system that confined them. They were thinking about what they felt, about what they wanted to say, about the specific person they missed or loved or feared or wanted to reach. The political dimension of their writing, the fact that it asserts a full humanity that Roman law denied, was probably not its primary motivation, but it is its most significant historical consequence. Beyond the love and loss inscriptions, the walls of Pompeii's domestic spaces preserve other traces of enslaved experience. There are inscriptions that appear to record the day-to-day transactions of household management, lists of provisions purchased, records of work completed, tallies of accounts managed. These practical inscriptions are in one sense the least personal of all the slave-authored texts, but in another sense they are among the most revealing, because they document the degree to which the smooth functioning of a Roman household depended entirely on the skill, knowledge, and reliability of its enslaved members. The steward who managed a household's accounts, the cook who provisioned its kitchen, the secretary who kept its correspondence. These people were essential to the material life of their owners in ways that made their legal classification as property a particularly brutal irony. There are also inscriptions that appear to document relationships between enslaved people within the same household, bonds of friendship, affection, and mutual support that formed within the constrained world of the servile community. Roman slave owners were well aware that enslaved people formed such bonds, and they had ambivalent attitudes toward them. On one hand, relationships between slaves could be useful, creating stability and mutual incentive within the household. On the other hand, close bonds between slaves were a potential source of collective resistance, and owners were sometimes advised to maintain division rather than solidarity among their human property. The inscriptions suggest that enslaved people formed bonds regardless of these calculations, that the human need for connection was not something that could be managed or suppressed by an owner's strategic preferences. The freed persons, those who had been enslaved and subsequently metanoted, freed, occupy a fascinating middle space in the Pompeian social record, and their voices are more numerous and more legible in the graffiti than those of the still enslaved. Roman manumission was, by the standards of ancient slave systems, relatively common. Owners freed slaves as rewards for long service, as provisions of their wills, as responses to personal affection, and as practical decisions about household management. A freed slave became a Roman citizen, which meant the right to vote, the right to engage in commerce, the right to marry legally, and the right to see one's children born free. These were not trivial gains. They represented a genuine transformation in legal status and social possibility. But the transition from enslaved to free was not a clean break. Freed persons remained bound to their former owners by ties of obligation and loyalty. They owed certain services, owed deference, owed what the Romans called gratia, the acknowledgement of a favor received. Their names carried the mark of their origin. A freedman took his former owner's family name, making his origins legible to anyone who knew how to read Roman nomenclature. He faced social prejudice from citizens who looked down on the formerly enslaved, and legal disabilities that prevented him from holding the highest civic offices, though his children, born free, faced no such restrictions. The freed person's life in Pompeii was thus one of genuine aspiration, real possibilities, real achievements, real social advancement, conducted against a background of stigma that never entirely disappeared. The voices of freed persons in the Pompeian graffiti reflect this complexity. Many of the most ambitious and self-assertive inscriptions in the city were written by freed persons, people who had everything to prove and knew it, who compensated for the stigma of their origins with conspicuous achievement and conspicuous expression. The freedman who scratched his name on the wall of the Forum was not simply recording his passage through the space he was claiming. Membership in the civic community of Pompeii, asserting a presence in the city's most formal and official space, refusing the invisibility that his origins might have been expected to impose. The commercial inscriptions of Pompeii are full of freed person voices. The advertisements, the price notices, the records of transactions that document the thriving economic life of a community of former slaves, who had turned their freedom into prosperity. The Augustals, the quasi-official body of wealthy freedmen who funded public entertainments and religious observances, appear in the epigraphic record as major patrons and public figures, their names attached to the dedications of statues, the funding of games, the repair of public buildings. These men had wealth and civic presence, and the desire to be remembered, and they used the walls of the city, as the free-born elite used them, to make their presence permanent. What the full sweep of the slave and freed person inscriptions in Pompeii ultimately reveals is the impossibility of the category that Roman law sought to maintain. Roman law said, "These people are not people." Roman law said, "They have no inner lives worthy of legal recognition, no relationships worthy of legal protection, no feelings worthy of legal consideration." And then they wrote on the walls about love and loss and friendship and longing and ambition and grief. And the walls said back, "They are people. They were always people. They were never anything but people." The category failed. The law failed. The human beings inside it did not. Chapter 8. Crude, clever, and profoundly human: Pompeii's insults and its humor. Let us begin with an acknowledgement that may come as a relief to anyone who has been finding the story of Pompeii's walls somewhat relentlessly moving. A great deal of what was written on those walls is simply, splendidly funny. Not funny in the careful, constructed way of Roman literary comedy, the elaborate plots of Plautus, the sophisticated wit of Terence, the carefully calibrated irony of Horace. Funny in the way that a joke told by a stranger at a bar is funny, or a remark shouted from a passing cart, or a sign someone has put up in a window that makes you stop walking and look twice, and then cover your mouth to hide the laugh. The humor of Pompeii's walls is immediate, irreverent, occasionally shocking, and absolutely democratic. It belongs to everyone. It was written by everyone, and 2,000 years later, a surprising amount of it still lands. The Romans had a rich tradition of verbal humor, one of the most developed in the ancient world. They valued wit as a social virtue, a mark of intelligence and quick-mindedness, and the ability to deliver a perfectly timed insult or a cleverly turned compliment was considered as admirable as physical courage or financial success in the right contexts. Cicero, the great orator and statesman, not a man you would immediately think of as a comedy writer, compiled a collection of witty sayings and jokes called Diiosus. now lost but ostensibly quoted in ancient sources, demonstrating that even the most serious minds of the Roman world took humor seriously as an art form. The Emperor Augustus was famous for his wit. Julius Caesar cultivated a reputation for sharp repartee. Wit, in Rome, was power. The power to make a room laugh, to deflect criticism with a joke, to cut an opponent down with a phrase so perfectly aimed that no response was possible. What the graffiti of Pompeii give us is this: wit operating below the literary level, in the streets and taverns and back alleys of a provincial city, among people who had never read Cicero and probably couldn't have cared less about Dioitzes, but who shared with the great orator the fundamental understanding that language could be a weapon, a gift, and a source of pleasure. The humor of Pompeii's walls is, in its essence, the humor of people enjoying the sound of their own cleverness, and sometimes, it must be said, simply enjoying the opportunity to say something rude in a public place without getting into too much trouble. The single most common form of humorous graffito in Pompeii is the insult. Romans were brilliant insulters. It was practically a civic skill, honed by the tradition of competitive public speaking and by a culture that considered verbal aggression a legitimate form of conflict resolution, or at least a satisfying substitute for it. The insults preserved on Pompeii's walls range from the elegantly general to the surgically specific, and from the mildly critical to the genuinely savage. They are aimed at individuals named targets who were presumably well known to whoever passed that particular stretch of wall, and they draw on a consistent vocabulary of contemptible qualities: stupidity, cowardice, sexual passivity, bad breath, dishonesty, social pretension, and an extensive list of anatomical attributes and deficiencies. The insult recorded as Sil 4, 1655. Phileros is a eunuch is one of the more restrained examples, remarkable mainly for its confident public declaration of what appears to be a deeply personal assessment of a named individual. The target, Phileros, was presumably someone known in the neighborhood where the inscription was found, someone whose identity and reputation were legible to anyone who passed by. The insult itself may have been literally true, metaphorically intended, or entirely malicious. Roman invective was not overly concerned with the distinction between factual claim and rhetorical exaggeration. What matters is the gesture. Someone had a strong feeling about Phileros and chose to express it on a wall, where Phileros, and everyone who knew Phileros, would see it. This is not subtle. It was never intended to be subtle. It was intended to sting, and to sting publicly. Other insults are considerably more elaborate. One of the most striking examples in the entire Pompeian corpus is an extended attack on a specific individual that covers several lines of careful, legible inscription, the product of someone who sat down metaphorically, at least, and composed an argument, rather than simply blurting out an epithet. The author marshals evidence, cites witnesses, and builds to a conclusion about the target's character that is rendered in terms of sufficient specificity to make clear this is a genuine grievance rather than random malice. It reads, in other words, exactly like a one-star review. The tone of aggrieved disappointment, the appeal to the testimony of others, the sense of a personal wrong that demands public acknowledgement. All of it is thoroughly modern in its emotional logic, and thoroughly human in its desire to be heard and validated. The counter-insult, the response to an insult found on the same wall, or on a nearby surface, is a particularly entertaining subspecies of the genre. We have already encountered the argument between Successus and Severus over the affections of Iris, which followed the logic of an escalating exchange of provocations. The gladiatorial district of Pompeii preserves several similar exchanges, rival fans attacking each other's heroes, or each other's intelligence, in inscriptions that accumulate over time into what can only be described as a very slow fight. The dynamics are identical to those of an online argument. The initial provocation, the outraged response, the counter-response that claims the moral high ground while delivering a more effective blow, the final sally that probably felt definitive to the person who wrote it and was probably ignored by its target. Beyond the insults, the humor of Pompeii's walls takes several other characteristic forms. There is the boast that tips over into absurdity, the man who declares himself the greatest lover in the city, or the most formidable fighter, or the most enviable possessor of any number of desirable qualities, in terms so extravagant that the joke becomes self-aware, the bravado so inflated that it pops under its own pressure. There is the complaint delivered with comic timing, the guest who was bitten by bedbugs, the traveler who found the road impossibly muddy, the diner who received a quantity of food that bore no relationship to the price charged, in which the genuine irritation is wrapped in a narrative performance that reveals a pleasure in the telling, as well as the grievance. There is the wordplay, the puns, the double meanings, the names used to comic effect that demonstrates a population playing with language, enjoying its textures and its possibilities, and what words literally say and what they actually mean. One of the most celebrated categories of Pompeian humor is the literary joke, inscriptions that engage with the canonical texts of Latin literature in comic or irreverent ways. Lines from Virgil's Aeneid appear on Pompeii's walls in several forms, correctly quoted by the seriously literary-minded, misquoted by the partially remembered, and deliberately distorted by the wits who found comedy in taking the most dignified lines of Rome's greatest epic and bending them to pathetic purposes. There is one inscription that takes the opening line of the Aeneid, Arma virim scano, I sing of arms and the man, and appends to it a continuation that substitutes the heroics of Aeneas for the considerably less heroic activities of its author's neighbor. The joke depends on recognition. You need to know the original to appreciate the subversion, which tells us something important about the level of literary education among at least some portion of Pompeii's wall-writing population. These were not illiterates amusing themselves with crude marks. These were people fluent enough in the great texts of Roman culture to play games with them. The drawings that accompany and sometimes constitute the humor of Pompeii's walls deserve a mention of their own. Alongside the text-based graffiti, Pompeii's surfaces are covered in sketched images, faces, animals, ships, gladiatorial equipment, erotic scenes, architectural fantasies, and caricatures. The caricatures are particularly interesting because they demonstrate the same instinct that produces political cartoons in every age, the desire to reduce a person or a type to their most ridiculous or most characteristic feature, to exaggerate until the truth becomes visible through the distortion. Several of the caricatures in Pompeii appear to depict recognizable public figures, magistrates, prominent citizens, possibly even gladiators, in situations of comic indignity, the visual equivalent of the insulting inscription transposed into the language of line and shape. The erotic graffiti of Pompeii, of which there are a great many, scattered throughout the city, but concentrated particularly around the brothels, the bathhouses, and the taverns, exist in an interesting space between humor and something more earnest. Roman attitudes to sexuality were, as noted earlier, organized around very different categories from modern Western norms, and what appears shocking or transgressive to a contemporary reader was often understood very differently by the person who wrote it. Some of the erotic graffiti are clearly comic. They employ the conventions of sexual boasting or sexual accusation in ways that emphasize the joke over any literal claim. Others are more genuinely expressive, records of desire or experience that the writer felt compelled to document in the most permanent medium available. The difficulty, 2,000 years later, is that the tone is not always recoverable. Whether a particular inscription was meant to amuse, or to inform, or to persuade, or simply to exist, is not always answerable from the text alone. What is answerable, and what the humorous graffiti of Pompeii demonstrate beyond any doubt, is that laughter was a constant companion of daily life in this city. People laughed at their neighbors, at their politicians, at their lovers, at themselves. They laughed at the pompous and the pretentious, at the unlucky and the incompetent, at the gap between how people presented themselves and how they actually were. They laughed at the physical facts of human existence, its indignities, its limitations, its unexpected failures, with a frankness that polite literary culture preferred to exclude. The bathhouse wall that records a bather's opinion of a fellow bather's physique, the tavern wall that preserves a drinking song of unrepeatable lewdness, the street corner inscription that reduces a prominent citizen to a single devastating epithet. All of these are evidence of a culture that understood humor as a fundamental human need, and the public wall as its most democratic venue. There is, too, a particular form of Pompeian wit that deserves to be called philosophical, though its practitioners would probably have laughed at the description. These are the inscriptions that comment, with varying degrees of irony and directness, on the human condition itself, on the brevity of life, the unpredictability of fortune, the ultimate futility of ambition and worry. Nothing can last for eternity appears on a wall in the Via della Bandanza. What is love? It is a sickness of the heart appears near one of the city's fountains. These inscriptions exist somewhere between the earnest and the sardonic. They may be sincere expressions of a philosophical view, or they may be jokes at the expense of earnestness. or they may be both simultaneously, in the manner of the best aphorisms. The fact that they were scratched onto the walls of a city that was unknown to its inhabitants in its final days before annihilation gives them a resonance their authors could not have intended. The Romans had a concept, or rather a practice, called parrhesia, a Greek word meaning frank speech, the willingness to say what one actually thinks, regardless of convention or consequence. It was associated primarily with the philosophical tradition of the Cynics, who made a point of speaking uncomfortable truths in public, and it was considered both admirable and socially dangerous in equal measure. The humorous graffiti of Pompeii are, in their way, a popular version of parrhesia, frank speech pressed into stone, the things that people actually thought about their neighbours and their city and their human situation, said without the filtering of social convention and literary decorum. They are the city thinking out loud, at its most unguarded, and that is precisely why they are so valuable, because when a city thinks out loud, what it reveals is not its formal values, the values declared in public speeches and official inscriptions and the carefully polished texts of literature. What it reveals is its actual texture, its petty grievances and its genuine affections, its vanities and its self-awareness, its capacity for cruelty and its capacity for laughter. The humorous graffiti of Pompeii reveal a city that was, in the fullest sense, alive to the comedy of its own existence, capable of laughing at itself and at the world, unwilling to let the pompousness of official culture have the last word on what daily life felt like from the inside. And so, as this chapter draws to its close and the quiet of the night settles in, let us leave Pompeii laughing, not because laughter is the most important thing its walls preserve, it isn't. Not because humor is the deepest note in the chord of human experience, it isn't that either, but because it is present, abundantly and irrepressibly, in a record that might otherwise seem entirely dominated by love and politics and loss. The people of Pompeii laughed. They made each other laugh. They wrote jokes on walls because they couldn't help it, because the joke was too good to keep to themselves, because the target was too tempting, because the blank plaster was right there, and the stylus was in their hand, and the thing just had to be said. Phileros is a eunuch, someone found that worth putting on a wall. Somewhere in Pompeii, 2,000 years ago, someone else read it and laughed. So did I. Chapter 9, Faith, Gods, and Sacred Walls. Religion scratched into everyday stone. The ancient city of Pompeii was, before it was anything else, a sacred city. Not in the sense that it was unusually pious or formally devoted to a particular cult above all others, but in the sense that the sacred and the everyday were so thoroughly woven together in Roman daily life that the distinction between them, a distinction that modernity tends to enforce quite sharply, would have been to most Pompeians nearly incomprehensible. The gods were not confined to temples. They lived in the streets, in the crossroads shrines called lauraria that appeared at the junction of every significant street, in the household shrines called larias that stood in the entrance halls of private homes, in the spaces between market stalls and above bakery ovens, and beside the doors of brothels and taverns and workshops. The sacred was everywhere, because the Romans placed it everywhere, wove it into the infrastructure of daily life, so completely that to pass through the city was to move continuously through a landscape saturated with divine presence. This saturation is reflected in the graffiti. Across the full range of Pompeii's wall writing, from the most personal love declarations to the most public electoral notices, religious references appear constantly, not always as the primary subject of the inscription, but as part of its texture. The way religious language permeates any culture in which faith is genuinely integrated into daily experience rather than segregated to specific times and spaces. A merchant records a transaction and adds a brief invocation of fortune. A traveler marks his arrival in the city and names the god who protected the journey. A lover declares his devotion and calls Venus as his witness. These are not elaborate theological statements. They are the automatic, half-conscious gestures of people living in a world in which divine attention was assumed to be real and worth acknowledging. Pompeii's religious landscape was strikingly diverse. The official Roman pantheon, Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Apollo, Diana, Bacchus, and the rest, was well represented, as you would expect in a thoroughly Romanized city. But alongside the Olympian gods, the city hosted a remarkable range of other cults, many of them imported from the Eastern Mediterranean world that Roman expansion had brought into intimate contact with Italy. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian mother goddess, whose appeal to Romans lay in her promises of personal salvation, divine protection, and life after death, was particularly strong in Pompeii. The city had a substantial temple dedicated to Isis, one of the best preserved ancient temples anywhere in the world, and the walls of the surrounding district are covered in inscriptions invoking her name and recording her worship. The appeal of Isis in a Roman provincial city like Pompeii illuminates something important about the religious needs that the official Roman cult system did not fully satisfy. The gods of the Roman state religion were, in the main, interested in the state, in the welfare of Rome, the success of its armies, the prosperity of its harvests, the legitimacy of its political order. They were transactional deities, approached with specific requests, and expected to respond with specific favors if the ritual was performed correctly. What Isis offered was different: a personal relationship with the Divine Mother, an intimate care for the individual's soul, a promise of protection that extended beyond death. These were the things that people, as individuals, rather than citizens, most urgently needed from their gods, and the cults that offered them, Isis, Mithras, later Christianity, spread throughout the Roman world with an energy that the official religion could not match. The inscriptions associated with the cult of Isis in Pompeii range from formal dedicatory texts, records of offerings made, vows fulfilled, temples repaired, to informal personal declarations of devotion that express something closer to what we would recognize as personal faith. One category of Isis inscription found in Pompeii records the experience of dreaming of the goddess, a phenomenon that the Isis cult particularly encouraged, through the practice of incubation, in which devotees slept in the temple precincts in the hope of receiving divine visions. These dream inscriptions are among the most intimate religious documents in the entire Pompeian record. They record a private experience, a moment of felt contact with the divine, pressed into the public wall, as testimony and perhaps as offering. They are evidence of genuine religious experience, not the performance of civic duty, not the fulfillment of contractual obligation, but something more personal and more searching. The Jewish and Christian presence in Pompeii is documented, in part, through the graffiti, and the evidence, though fragmentary and disputed, is historically significant. By the time of the eruption in 79 AD, Jewish communities had been present in Italy for well over a century, brought originally as slaves following the Roman conquests of Judea, and subsequently developing into substantial free communities in several Italian cities. Whether Pompeii had a significant Jewish community is uncertain, but there are inscriptions that scholars have identified as potentially Jewish in origin, certain names and certain patterns of phrasing that are more consistent with Jewish than with standard Roman usage, and at least one inscription that appears to use a form of address characteristic of Jewish funerary practice. More striking is the evidence for early Christian presence. The famous inscription in a private house that juxtaposes the words Sodom and Gomorrah with a cross-like symbol has attracted enormous scholarly attention, largely because it would, if genuinely Christian in origin, represent one of the earliest physical traces of Christianity in the Western Roman world. The dating is contentious. The inscription could postdate the eruption, appearing during later visits to the ruins, or it could be contemporary with the living city. But the possibility that Christians were present in Pompeii in 79 AD is not historically implausible. The Apostle Paul had written to communities in nearby Puteoli and Rome. The Christian message was spreading through the commercial networks of the Mediterranean world, and a port-adjacent commercial city like Pompeii would have been precisely the kind of place where new religious ideas arrived early. The Pompeian graffiti also preserved evidence of magical practice, a dimension of ancient religious life that the official cults acknowledged but often struggled to domesticate. Cursed tablets, magical formulas, invocations of chthonic deities for the purpose of harming enemies or compelling the affections of reluctant lovers. All of these appear in the Pompeian record, sometimes scratched onto walls, sometimes inscribed on lead sheets and deposited in wells or graves. The world of Roman magic was not separate from the world of Roman religion. It drew on the same deities, used the same ritual vocabulary, operated within the same framework of assumptions about divine power and human vulnerability. What distinguished magic from religion, in the Roman understanding, was not its ontology but its ethics. Magic was religion deployed for personal and sometimes harmful purposes rather than for the common good. The curse inscriptions of Pompeii, defixiones in the Latin technical term, are among the most viscerally direct of all the city's wall writings. They name specific individuals and ask specific divine powers to harm them in specific ways. They are written in the second person, addressed to the deity being petitioned, with a directness that is both startling and, once you adjust your expectations, entirely comprehensible. The person writing a cursed tablet had been wronged, or believed they had been wronged, and was turning to the most powerful forces available to them to redress the balance. The fact that this meant petitioning a chthonic deity to afflict their enemy with a list of misfortunes that sometimes ran to considerable specificity was, in the Roman framework, simply practical. The gods were tools, among other things, powerful tools, requiring careful handling, but tools nonetheless. Alongside the curse inscriptions are their counterparts, the protective inscriptions, the apotropaic marks, the symbols and formulas designed not to harm but to shield. Doorframes in Pompeii carry scratched images of phalli, which served in Roman culture as symbols of luck and fertility, as much as of sexuality, intended to ward off the evil eye and protect the household from malevolent attention. Crossroads shrines were painted with images of the lares, the divine protectors of the neighborhood, whose goodwill was maintained through small regular offerings. Inside houses, the lararium, the household shrine, bore inscriptions and images that integrated the family's daily life into a continuous relationship of mutual obligation with the divine. These protective inscriptions are not the product of unusual piety or unusual fear. They are the product of a culture that assumed the world was full of invisible forces, that those forces required management, and that the right words in the right places could be a form of management. The religious graffiti of Pompeii also illuminates what might be called the theology of the ordinary, the specific beliefs and concerns that motivated the religious practices of people who were not philosophers or priests but simply inhabitants of a city going about their daily lives. What did they actually worry about? The inscriptions suggest the safety of loved ones on journeys, the success of business ventures, the health of children and elderly parents, the fertility of marriages and fields, the outcome of legal disputes and elections, the protection of property against theft and fire. These are the concerns that drove people to the temples and the shrines, that prompted the vow and the offering and the prayer scratched into the plaster of a roadside lararium. They are not metaphysical concerns, not questions about the nature of the divine or the structure of the cosmos, but intensely practical ones. The gods were approached, most of the time, because a person needed something specific and believed that the right divine connection might provide it. What is striking, reading across the full range of Pompeii's religious inscriptions, is the degree to which the formal categories of the Roman religious world, the distinction between different gods, different cults, different ritual practices, were blurred or dissolved in popular practice. People invoked multiple deities in the same breath, combined elements of different cults without apparent anxiety about their theoretical compatibility, and moved between the official state religion and the imported mystery cults and the world of magic and curse tablets with a pragmatism that modern observers, accustomed to thinking of religion as a matter of exclusive commitment and doctrinal boundaries, sometimes find difficult to pass. The Pompeian was not confused or incoherent. They simply lived in a religious universe with a different structure, one defined not by doctrine but by practice, not by belief but by relationship. This religious pragmatism is perhaps most vividly illustrated by the evidence from Pompeii for the simultaneous presence of multiple religious traditions in close physical proximity. Isis worship and the Jupiter cult and Jewish practice and possibly early Christianity, all within a few streets of each other. Their adherents sharing the same baths and markets and taverns, their inscriptions sometimes appearing on the same stretches of wall. The city did not experience this plurality as a contradiction or a crisis. For the most part, it experienced it as the natural consequence of being a commercial city in a large and diverse empire, a place where people of many origins and many allegiances came and stayed, and brought their gods with them, and found room for them alongside the gods already present. This is the last lesson that Pompeii's religious graffiti teach us before we move on, and it is one worth carrying into sleep, that the human need for the sacred, for something larger than the self, for protection in a dangerous world, for the sense that one is known and cared for by forces beyond the merely human, is as old as the walls of any city, and as universal as the need to scratch one's name into the plaster of the world. The Pompeians wrote to their gods on walls and tablets, and in the dark of the temple, and they did so with the same mixture of hope and desperation and gratitude that characterizes prayer in every tradition. The specific names of the gods they invoked have mostly faded into the historical record. The feeling that prompted the invocation has not faded at all. Chapter X, the scholars who listened to centuries of decoding the walls, Every story about the dead depends, in the end, on the living who chose to listen. The voices of Pompeii did not simply reach across 2,000 years on their own momentum. They were carried, passed hand to hand, through generations of scholars who devoted their working lives to the slow, difficult, sometimes unglamorous work of reading walls. This chapter is their story, or at least the part of it that can be told, without doing too great an injustice to its complexity. The story of how a city buried under meters of volcanic debris became, through the patient application of human curiosity and human method, the most intimately known place in the ancient world. We begin in 1748, in the Kingdom of Naples, under the rule of Charles of Bourbon, the future Charles III of Spain. Charles was, by the standards of 18th century monarchs, genuinely interested in antiquity, and when reports reached him that a site near the town of Resina might contain the buried remains of an ancient city, he commissioned excavations with an enthusiasm that contrasted sharply with the indifference of his predecessors. The first discoveries were at Herculaneum, Pompeii's smaller sister city, also destroyed by Vesuvius, buried under a much deeper and harder deposit of volcanic material that made excavation far more difficult. Pompeii itself began to emerge from the earth within a few years, and what appeared was, by any measure, extraordinary. The earliest excavators were not archaeologists in any modern sense. They were treasure hunters, operating under royal commission, tasked with recovering objects of aesthetic and monetary value for the collections of the Bourbon court. Statues, paintings, jewelry, bronze vessels, these were the prizes that justified the expense of excavation, and the recovery of such objects was, in the early decades, the primary goal. The walls themselves, covered in their painted images and scratched inscriptions, were treated as the packaging rather than the content. Interesting backdrops, certainly, but not the point. Many inscriptions were recorded only carelessly, or not at all. Many graffiti that appeared on walls, exposed to air and light during excavation, faded and disappeared before anyone thought to copy them down. The loss is immeasurable, and it is the first of several reasons why any account of Pompeian scholarship must be tinged with the awareness of what was irreversibly destroyed in the process of discovery. The first figure to bring systematic method to the site was Giuseppe Fiorelli, who assumed direction of the Pompeii excavations in 1863 under the newly unified Italian state. Fiorelli was a different kind of scholar from his predecessors, trained in the emerging discipline of scientific archaeology, committed to the principle that context was as important as content, and convinced that the real value of Pompeii lay not in the individual objects it yielded, but in the totality of the information it preserved about ancient life. His innovations were practical and systematic. He divided the excavated city into regions, insulae blocks, and numbered doorways, the grid system that archaeologists still use today. He insisted that the position of finds be recorded before objects were removed. He trained his excavators to observe and document rather than simply dig and retrieve. His most famous innovation was the technique of making plaster casts of the voids left by decomposed organic material, human bodies, animals, wooden furniture, tree roots in the hardened volcanic matrix. When Fiorelli and his team discovered a hollow space in the pumice and poured liquid plaster into it, what solidified was the exact form of whatever had once occupied that space. For the human victims of the eruption, this meant reconstructing the precise position of their bodies in the moment of death, some curled in the fetal position, some apparently running, some covering their faces with their hands, some sheltering together in groups. The plaster casts of Pompeii's dead are among the most emotionally powerful artifacts in the world, and they are entirely Fiorelli's creation. But Fiorelli was also the first scholar to treat the inscriptions of Pompeii with the systematic seriousness they deserved. He understood that the writing on the walls was not decoration or marginal commentary, but a primary source, in some respects a more valuable primary source than the famous artworks the excavations had produced, because it spoke in the voices of the people who had actually lived in the city rather than in the visual language of professional craftsmen. His documentation of inscriptions, while incomplete by later standards, established the principle that the words on the walls mattered as much as the images. The systematic scholarly publication of Pompeii's inscriptions was taken up in earnest by Karl Zengermeister, a German classical philologist working within the framework of the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, the great collaborative project, headquartered at the Berlin Academy of Sciences and Humanities, that aimed to publish every surviving Latin inscription from the entire Roman world. Volume 4 of the CIL, for which Zengermeister was primarily responsible, appeared in 1871 and represented the most comprehensive catalogue of Pompeian inscriptions assembled to that date. Nearly 4,000 texts, transcribed, numbered, and annotated with meticulous care. Zengermeister worked at a time when much of Pompeii had not yet been excavated, the city of the century, and continues to do so today, and his century and continues to do so today of Celius, and iskenues of no excantius, and expandius excandius expandeds, exkenging in, exkanyung, beginning skinuin skinuginks, exans, exans exkanks gox makes ken bands xwix and sets out can we can't we could walk out with west wall with school cow up with this with soft bow I work up with a cock or at task or art pesca or scoffla or how sec more back oh well cascas bosk no mess abo is it was a the scholarly culture within which these men worked was very different from ours. 19th century classical philology was an intensely competitive, sometimes brutal discipline, conducted in the prestigious journals and learned societies of Germany, Italy, France, and Britain, by scholars who took their academic quarrels extremely seriously. The question of how to read a damaged or ambiguous inscription, whether a partially legible word should be reconstructed one way or another, whether a text was genuine or a later forgery, whether a particular passage was to be dated before or after a specific event, could generate years of published controversy, with reputations and careers depending on the outcome. The Pompeian inscriptions were not exempt from these battles. Some of the most famous disputes in the history of classical scholarship concern specific texts from Pompeii, arguments about readings and interpretations that drew in the most eminent Latinists of the age. The 20th century brought new methods and new questions to the study of Pompeian inscriptions. Social histories rise to the center of classical studies, driven by the influence of schools of historical thought that were interested in the lives of ordinary people rather than the deeds of great men, transformed the way scholars looked at the graffiti. Rather than treating the inscriptions primarily as sources of linguistic and textual data, social historians began reading them as evidence for social structures, economic practices, gender relations, and the texture of daily life. The work of Paul Zanker on the imagery of Augustan Rome, of John Darms on Roman commerce, of Andrew Wallace Hadrill on the domestic architecture of Pompeii, all of these major scholarly contributions depended, in part, on the evidence preserved in the inscriptions, and all of them demonstrated that the walls of a provincial city could illuminate aspects of Roman history that no amount of reading the literary sources would have revealed. The study of the electoral notices underwent a particular transformation in the hands of Henrik Moritzen, whose 1988 book on Pompeian politics challenged the prevailing understanding of how the city's elections actually worked. Moritzen argued, on the basis of a careful analysis of the spatial distribution and chronology of the programmata, that the electoral notices did not function as straightforward appeals to the voting public in the way that scholars had assumed. Instead, he proposed, they were the product of a complex system of social obligation and competitive display, in which the act of commissioning or endorsing a notice was as socially significant as the message it conveyed. The argument was controversial, it remained so, but it demonstrated the kind of insight that close attention to the inscriptions, read against each other and against the physical archaeology of the city, could generate. The study of the more informal graffiti, the personal declarations, the insults, the love inscriptions, the gladiatorial records found its great champion in Antonio Varrone, whose long career at the Pompeii archaeological site produced both excavation reports and synthetic scholarly works that brought the human dimensions of the wall writing to a wide audience. Varrone's work on the erotic inscriptions, in particular, demonstrated that this most embarrassing and most frequently overlooked category of graffiti was actually among the richest sources for understanding Roman sexuality, gender relations, and social hierarchy. His approach, patient, empirical, resistant to both moralizing disapproval and sensationalist celebration, set a model for subsequent scholarship. The digital revolution has, in the 21st century, transformed the study of Pompeian inscriptions in ways that Fiorelli or Zengermeister could not have imagined. The Ancient Graffiti Project, launched in 2012 under the direction of Rebecca Benefiel at Washington and Lee University, created a freely accessible online database of all known handwritten inscriptions from Pompeii and Herculaneum, currently numbering well over 6,000 texts, with searchable fields for content, location, writing type, language, date, and dozens of other variables. For the first time, a researcher anywhere in the world could ask questions of the entire corpus simultaneously. How many inscriptions appear within 50 meters of the amphitheater? How does the distribution of electoral notices compare to the distribution of erotic graffiti? Which names appear most frequently, and where? The database made possible a kind of macroscopic analysis of the inscription record that had been impossible when scholars could only examine individual texts or small groups of texts at a time. The physical archaeology of Pompeii continues to yield new inscriptions, and each new discovery adds to the corpus that scholars study. The excavations in the previously unexcavated Reggio V sector of Pompeii, which began in earnest around 2017 and continued to the present, have produced a remarkable series of finds that include not only new graffiti but entire new rooms, new frescoes, and new evidence about the physical structure of the city in its final phase. Among the most significant recent epigraphic finds is the charcoal inscription discussed in Chapter 1, the apparent date reference that suggests the eruption occurred in October rather than August, which serves as a reminder that the work of understanding Pompeii is far from complete, and that the walls still have things to tell us that we have not yet heard. What this chapter most wants to convey, before it ends and the quiet returns, is the texture of the scholarly endeavor itself. What it actually feels like to spend a working life reading the walls of a dead city. It is work that requires, simultaneously, enormous technical precision and enormous imaginative sympathy. The technical precision is necessary because the texts are damaged, incomplete, often ambiguous, and easily misread. A wrong transcription, a wrong reading of a damaged letter, can send an interpretation entirely astray. The imaginative sympathy is necessary because the texts are, in their essence, human communications, and reading them as purely technical objects, as data, rather than as voices, is to miss what makes them important. The scholars who have devoted themselves to this work over 2 centuries have understood, at their best, that they are engaged in something that goes beyond the normal ambitions of academic research. They are engaged in listening in the slow, patient, technically demanding work of hearing voices that were almost silenced by history, that were preserved by accident, that have been waiting in the dark of the volcanic debris for someone to find them and understand what they are saying. When Zengermeister sat in the ruins of Pompeii with his notebooks and his careful Latin, transcribing inscription after inscription onto the pages that would become Volume 4 of the CIL, he was doing something that sounds dry and philological, and is, in its actual human significance, an act of extraordinary moral seriousness. He was insisting that these voices be heard. When Rebecca Benefield and her colleagues built a digital database that makes those voices accessible to anyone with an internet connection, they were doing the same thing in a new medium and at a new scale. The method has changed, the technology has changed, the scale has changed enormously. The fundamental act has not changed at all. It is still listening. It is still the choice to attend to voices that history tried to bury, and to give them, at last, the audience they always deserved. Chapter She, The Last Days. What the final inscriptions tell us. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows the end of a sound that was very loud. Not the absence of noise, exactly, but its photographic negative, a shape in the air where the sound was, an impression that persists after the source has stopped. The people of Pompeii did not experience this silence because they were inside the sound when it ended, but we experience it on their behalf. Every time we read the final inscriptions, the texts written in the days and weeks immediately before the eruption, the last words that the city pressed into its own walls before the mountain ended the conversation, we cannot always identify with certainty which inscriptions were the last ones written. Pompeii's graffiti accumulated over centuries, layer upon layer, and the process of dating individual texts within that accumulation is difficult and often imprecise. Painted inscriptions can sometimes be dated by the political context they reference a candidate's name, a public event that can be placed within a known chronological framework. Scratched inscriptions are harder to date because they carry fewer contextual clues and because the physical process of scratching into plaster leaves no chemical or material signature that allows precise dating. For most of the graffiti on Pompeii's walls, we know only that they were written before 79 AD, sometime between the city's foundation and its destruction, in a span of several centuries, but there is a category of inscription that scholars have tentatively identified as belonging to the final period, the weeks, perhaps the days, before the eruption. These are texts that reference events or persons datable to the late 70s AD, inscriptions that mention political figures active in that period, electoral notices for candidates whose careers can be placed in those years, commercial records that reference transactions in the Vespasianic or early Flavian period. When these texts are read against each other, and against the physical stratigraphy of the site, the layers of plaster and paint that record the sequence of decoration and redecoration, a picture emerges of a city that was, in its final phase, actively and vigorously writing on its own walls. This was not a city in decline, not a community that had run out of things to say. It was a city at full rhetorical throttle, conducting its civic business and its personal dramas with the energy of a place that expected to continue indefinitely. And then there is the charcoal inscription found in Reggio 5 in 2018. The one that has tentatively but compellingly shifted the accepted date of the eruption by nearly 2 months. The inscription in question was found in a house that was undergoing renovation at the time of the eruption. Its walls had been stripped back to bare brick in preparation for replastering, and it was on this bare brick surface that a workman, or perhaps the homeowner, or perhaps a visitor to the building site, scratched a series of marks in charcoal, the most ephemeral and most immediately available of all writing materials. The marks include what appears to be a date, the 16th day before the calends of November, which translates in the modern calendar to the 17th of October. If this date refers to the eruption, if the inscription was made shortly before or during the event, then the consequences for our understanding of the Pompeian record are significant. An October eruption reconciles the physical evidence beautifully. The heavier clothing on the victims, the autumn produce in the market stalls, the sealed wine jars from the new harvest. It also means that Pliny the Younger, writing his famous letters to Tacitus roughly 25 years after the eruption and working from memory and possibly from notes whose original dating had been misread or corrupted in copying, gave us a date 2 months off. This is not a devastating blow to Pliny's credibility. He was, after all, describing a traumatic experience from a quarter century earlier, and the corruption of a single date in a manuscript tradition is a very ordinary textual event. But it is a reminder, as the graffiti are always reminding us, that a single inscription found in a newly excavated room can change what we thought we knew. What makes the story of Pompeii's last days so hauntingly particular is not the catastrophe itself. The eruption of a volcano is a natural event, terrible in its consequences but not unique in human history. What makes it haunting is the ordinariness of what was interrupted. The archaeological record of Pompeii's final phase shows a city going about its normal business in every detail. Food being prepared, building work underway, commercial transactions being recorded, candidates presumably still campaigning for elections that would never be held. The renovation work in the Reggio V house, where the charcoal inscription was found, is itself a piece of this ordinariness. Someone had decided that a room in their house needed new plaster, had hired the workmen, had watched them strip the old surface back, had perhaps supervised the beginning of the new work, and had never seen it finished. The literary record of the eruption is dominated by Pliny the Younger's 2 letters, written to the historian Tacitus at Tacitus's request, describing what Pliny witnessed from the naval base at Misenum across the Bay of Naples and what he later learned about the death of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who sailed toward Vesuvius to investigate the phenomenon and to rescue trapped refugees, and who perished in the attempt. These letters are extraordinary documents among the finest eyewitness accounts of a natural disaster anywhere in ancient literature, and they have shaped the way every subsequent generation has imagined the event. Pliny describes the column of ash and gas rising from the mountain like a pine tree, the darkness that fell over the bay, the trembling of the ground, the rain of pumice, the panic of the crowds. He writes with the precision of a trained observer and the restraint of a literary craftsman who knows that understatement can be more powerful than elaboration. But Pliny was not in Pompeii. He was across the bay, watching from a distance. The experience of those inside the city is available to us only through the physical evidence, the positions of the bodies, the contents of the rooms, the objects abandoned in the streets, and through the graffiti, the last inscriptions written before the end, which acquire, in retrospect, the quality of final words. even though no one who wrote them knew that was what they were. There is an inscription found near one of Pompeii's city gates that records the name of a traveler and the date of his arrival in the city, with the formulaic addition that fortune has favored his journey. He gave his name, he noted the date, he recorded his gratitude to the goddess who had protected the road, and then, presumably, he went about his business in Pompeii, ate at a thermopolium, perhaps, or visited the baths, or conducted whatever transaction had brought him to the city, never suspecting that the arrival he was so grateful for would prove to be the last journey he ever made. There is a price notation found in a shop near the Forum, a brief record of the cost of a commodity, scratched in the margin of the painted wall in the way that shopkeepers made quick practical notes to themselves. The commodity, the price, the day's business, ordinary, functional, utterly unremarkable, and written within days or weeks of the eruption that would seal it in volcanic rock for 19 centuries. There is the half-finished electoral notice painted in a professional hand, the candidate's name in large red letters, the endorsing group identified, but the text somehow cut off before completion, as if the signwriter was interrupted mid-job and never returned to finish it. We cannot know why the inscription was left incomplete. Perhaps the signwriter simply moved on to the next commission and the finishing touches were never added. Perhaps the election had passed before the notice could be finalized. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that haunts the interruption, was permanent. The final days in Pompeii had another dimension that the archaeological record has progressively illuminated. The days were not, for everyone, a surprise. The earthquake of 62 AD, 17 years before the eruption, had badly damaged the city and had, for those who cared to read the signs, announced the geological instability of the region. Rebuilding work was still underway in 79 AD on buildings damaged in that earlier earthquake. Some structures had not been fully repaired even after nearly 2 decades. There had been other tremors in the years between 62 and 79, smaller than the Great Earthquake, but sufficient to remind the population that the ground beneath them was not entirely stable. And in the days and weeks immediately preceding the eruption, there appeared to have been intensifying seismic events, tremors that, if they had been understood correctly, would have provided warning enough to evacuate. Some people did leave. Archaeological analysis of the victim population, the bodies found within the city when it was excavated, suggests that a significant proportion of Pompeii's residents managed to escape before the worst of the eruption, either because they fled early when the first signs appeared, or because they happened to be out of the city when it began. Those who stayed, whether from choice, from inability to move, from disbelief in the danger, or from the fatal human tendency to assume that what has not happened before will not happen now, were the ones the ash preserved. Their final acts, their final objects, their final words, these are what we have. Among those final words, some of the most moving are the simplest: a name scratched into the wall of a room, a date, a declaration of love that we now know was written in the last weeks of the city's existence, though the person who wrote it had no idea they were composing a farewell. These minimal texts, the ones that seem least freighted with significance, that seem most like the unremarkable daily deposits of ordinary life, acquire, in retrospect, a weight that their authors could not have imagined. Every casual inscription in Pompeii is also, in a sense, a last word. Every scratched name is also, in a sense, a goodbye. There is something in this that deserves to be held quietly, rather than stated loudly, something that exceeds the capacity of argument or explanation to convey. We are the last audience that these words were written for, though no one who wrote them knew it. They addressed their inscriptions to their neighbours, their rivals, their lovers, their gods, their candidates, their gladiatorial heroes, and they wound up addressing us, across the full distance of 20 centuries, past the eruption and the burial and the long darkness and the slow excavation and the patient scholarship. They have reached us. They are still reaching us. In the days before the end, Pompeii wrote on its walls, as it always had, love, politics, food, faith, humor, grief, the whole vocabulary of daily life, pressed into the plaster of a city that did not know it was dying. The mountain was quiet, the sky was blue, the bread was warm, and on the walls, the city was talking, as it had always talked, as it would always talk, until it couldn't. Chapter 12, The Wall That Never Stopped Speaking, Why These Voices Still Matter. We have come a long way together through these pages, through the frozen morning of 79 AD and the layered world of Pompeii's streets, through love affairs scratched in stone and election campaigns painted across entire city blocks, through gladiatorial celebrity and enslaved grief, and the raucous comedy of ordinary daily life, through the temples and their competing gods, and the scholars who gave their lives to listening, through the final ordinary days and the last inscriptions that nobody knew were farewells. We have traveled the full length of a city's inner life, guided by the words that city pressed into its own walls. And now we arrive at the end of the journey, which is also, as all genuine endings are, a beginning of sorts, a place from which the significance of everything we have heard can be seen whole. So let us sit with that. Let us take the time, before sleep comes and this story settles into dream, to ask the question that the story has been building toward from its very first sentence. Why does this matter? Not why is it interesting. The graffiti of Pompeii are obviously interesting, obviously fascinating, obviously worth knowing about. But why does it matter? What difference does it make, to us, in our lives, in our world, that the walls of a provincial Roman city preserve the love, declarations and insults and jokes and prayers of people who have been dead for 2,000 years? The first answer is the most obvious one, and it is not the most important, but it should be said. Pompeii's graffiti matter because they are evidence. They are evidence for things we could not know without them, for the distribution of literacy in the Roman world, for the structure of local politics in a provincial Italian city, for the social geography of a commercial urban center, for the religious plurality of the first-century Mediterranean world, for the career records of gladiators whose names would otherwise be entirely unknown, for the dietary practices and commercial transactions and sexual desires and personal grievances of people at every level of Roman society. Without the graffiti, we would know the Roman world primarily through its most literate and most powerful voices. With the graffiti, we know it through the voices of everyone. This is not a small thing. It is, in the context of ancient history, almost miraculous. But the second answer is the more important one, and it is the one that the graffiti themselves seem most to insist on. They matter because they are human, because the feelings they express, the love and the longing, the ambition and the resentment, the faith and the doubt, the laughter and the grief, are not historical curiosities, but living realities, present in every human life, in every age. When Successus the weaver scratched his declaration of love for Iris, the innkeeper's slave, onto the wall of a building in the Basilica district of Pompeii, he was not performing a historical act. He was performing a human act, the same act that has been performed in every language and in every medium available to every person who has ever felt strongly enough about someone to want to put the feeling somewhere permanent. The medium changes, the feeling does not. This is what the graffiti of Pompeii ultimately demonstrate, and why the demonstration matters. That the distance between the ancient world and the modern one is not as great as the machinery of historical scholarship can sometimes make it appear. The dates and the emperors and the unfamiliar political structures and the alien religious practices, all of these create the impression of a world radically different from our own, a world that requires specialist translation before it can be approached. And in important respects, this impression is correct. The Roman world was genuinely different, and that difference should be respected rather than collapsed. But beneath the difference, the graffiti reveal a continuity that is more fundamental than any historical distance, the continuity of human emotional experience, of the needs and desires and frustrations and joys that constitute what it is to be a person in any time, in any place. The person who complained about the missing chamber pot was annoyed in a way that requires no translation. The fans who scratched Celadus's name on every available surface were experiencing something any sports fan will recognize immediately. The man who wrote "Nothing can last for eternity" on a wall in the Via dell'Abbondanza was doing what people have always done when confronted with the transience of things. He was trying to make the feeling permanent by expressing it in the most durable medium available. The irony that the sentiment about impermanence was itself preserved with near-perfect permanence by the very eruption that destroyed the city is the kind of irony that seems almost literary, as if history were composing its own commentary. What the graffiti of Pompeii most powerfully demonstrate, taken as a whole, is the democracy of human feeling, not the democracy of social access or political participation. Pompeii was a deeply unequal society, as we have seen, in which access to power and autonomy and dignity varied enormously along the axes of gender, legal status, wealth, and birth. The democracy the graffiti reveal is something more fundamental, the democracy of emotional experience. The fact that the enslaved person in the kitchen and the magistrate in the forum were both capable of love and loss and laughter and longing in equal measure. that no social hierarchy has ever succeeded in monopolizing the capacity for feeling or the desire to express it. Pompeii's walls say this louder and more clearly than any manifesto could, because they say it in the actual words of the actual people, unmediated by editorial selection or literary polishing or the distorting lens of someone else's agenda. This is worth dwelling on, because it is genuinely extraordinary. We have, in the CIL and the Ancient Graffiti Project and the continuing excavations of the city, access to a body of direct human testimony from the ancient world that is unlike anything else that has survived a testimony, that includes the voices of the poor, the enslaved, the illiterate or nearly so, the female, the foreign, the socially marginal. Roman literature does not include these voices. Roman official epigraphy does not include them. The historical record of the ancient world, read in the conventional way, through the conventional sources, is almost entirely the record of a narrow slice of humanity, the literate, the powerful, the male, the free. Pompeii's walls are the exception. They are the record of everyone. The long arc of the scholarly project of listening to these walls, from Fiorelli's plaster casts, to Zengermeister's notebooks, to Benefield's digital database, is itself a story about moral choice. The choice to attend to voices that history tried to bury. The choice to insist that the words of a lovesick weaver and the records of a gladiatorial career and the complaint of a bedbug-bitten traveler are worth the same scholarly attention as the speeches of Cicero or the poetry of Virgil. This choice is not inevitable. It had to be made, repeatedly, by scholars who could have spent their careers on safer and more prestigious material and chose instead to devote themselves to the slow work of reading walls. The field of classical studies is broader and richer and more honest because they made that choice, and the people of Pompeii, who spent their lives in a society that ranked them and categorized them and assigned them different degrees of worth, are better served by history because of it. As we approach the very end of our journey, it seems right to return to the beginning, to the specific quality of the graffiti that made this whole story worth telling. The quality that announces itself on every wall and in every scratched inscription and in every carefully painted electoral notice. That quality is presence. The people who wrote on Pompeii's walls were declaring their presence in the world. I was here, I felt this, I wanted this to be known. They were making the gesture that human beings have always made when confronted with the vastness of time and the smallness of an individual life. The gesture of insisting, against all the evidence, on their own significance, on the fact that they existed, on the fact that they felt, on the fact that the world should know about it. The world has been slow to listen. It took 17 centuries for anyone to read these inscriptions after the ash fell. It took another century and a half for scholarship to develop the methods and the values necessary to hear them properly, to understand that the crude joke and the declaration of love and the complaint about the innkeeper were as historically significant as the temple inscription or the electoral notice, that the voice of the enslaved was as worth hearing as the voice of the magistrate, that the full democracy of human expression on these walls was the whole point rather than an embarrassment to be managed. But the walls waited. They have extraordinary patience. Walls. They hold whatever is pressed into them, and they wait, with the inexhaustible patience of stone, for someone to come and read what is written there. The walls of Pompeii held the voices of 11,000 people through the darkness of 17 centuries and delivered them to us, to Fiorelli with his plaster and his notebooks, to Zengermeister with his meticulous Latin, to Verone and Moritzen and Benefield with their various scholarly tools, and now to you, reading these words, listening to a city that the mountain tried to silence and that refused, as human beings always refuse, to be entirely silenced. The next time you pass a wall with words on it, scratched or sprayed or chalked or painted, rude or tender or political, or simply the board notation of someone who had a marker and a free minute, look at it differently. Look at it the way Fiorelli looked at the walls of Pompeii, as testimony, as evidence of a person who was here, who felt something, who wanted the world to know. The medium is different. The impulse is identical. It has always been identical. From the finger tracings in the clay of the prehistoric caves, to the hammered bronze of the Roman Forum, to the plaster of the Via dell'Abbondanza, to the digital surfaces we write on now, the gesture is the same. I am here. I feel this. Listen. Pompeii listened to itself for centuries, wall by patient wall. The mountain tried to end the conversation. It did not succeed. The conversation is still going. It comes to you across 20 centuries. in the love and the laughter and the grief and the politics and the faith of people whose names we can read and whose feelings we can recognize. And it asks of you only the thing it has always asked: attention, presence, the willingness to stop and look at the wall and hear what it says. The city is still talking. Are you listening? I think you are. Good night.